had rewritten everything we were. My wife understands me really well. She can guess where I will take her out to dinner, even though I try to surprise her. She also knows when I need some extra care. She knows all about my life, from my awkward attempts to flirt in high school to the disappointment of missing out on a promotion I thought I earned. She knows I'm very scared of snakes, no matter if they are harmful or not. She can't stand to hear small children cry. It makes me want to comfort them. She knows this is because my father never hugged me. I share everything about myself with my beloved wife. She knows I always take lunch at 11:30 each day. I started doing this when I was the newest person at work, so I needed to take my break early. I would always get back by 12:30 because that is when others took their break. I got used to this routine and never changed it. But, as life would have it, things can change. My wife doesn't know I am taking a longer lunch today. Everyone in the office is going to a farewell party for one of the senior leaders, the director of the Research and Development branch where I work. Bill Thornton is retiring after 36 years, and the whole office is celebrating his retirement. Lyle is one of the younger engineers in my division, and I enjoy having him on my team. He works hard, has great ideas, and finds solutions to problems. When it was time for raises and bonuses, I was glad to recommend him. With his first big bonus, Lyle bought a huge Chevy Suburban. He had one child and another on the way, so he wanted a big vehicle for his growing family. I thought the SUV was so big it could fit many families, but he was proud of it and wanted to show it off. Since I was more experienced, I got to sit in the front seat with him on the way to the convention center. "So, Ron, what do you think of my new car?" Lyle asked. "That's me. I'm Ron, also known as Ronald Masters. I'm 29 years old, in good health and respected in my field of mechanical engineering, even though my job lately has involved less engineering work. I haven't been a manager for long, but it is taking more of my time. I'm even thinking about taking evening classes in management to keep up with my new responsibilities." "It looks great," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Or is hot the right word these days? I can never keep up with the latest words, I joked. He laughed in response. "You like it?" "Oh, absolutely," I said with a smile. I turned around to take a look inside the roomy vehicle. "Wow, Lyle," I said. "The first apartment Sherry and I lived in was probably smaller than this." He laughed, clearly pleased by my comment, and I turned back toward the front. As Lyle slowed to a stop at a red light, I noticed again how high off the road we were. Lyle's truck, as he liked to call it, offered a great view of the road, high above most of the other cars. I glanced out the passenger window when something caught my eye. To my surprise, I saw my wife sitting in her car, a 2-year-old Taurus next to us at the light. This wasn't an area she'd usually be in. Her office was far from here, and it was rare for her to be out during the day. Curious, I started to look for the window controls, wanting to get her attention, but it was taking too long. I was about to open the door and knock on her car window when I noticed something unexpected. As I looked closer, I saw a man's hand move across to her side of the car. I froze. A sharp, sudden ache knotted in my stomach, and a cold feeling rushed through me. My hand shook slightly where it rested on the door handle, and for a moment I felt utterly lost, unable to think or move. All I could do was stare. I waited, expecting Sherry to pull away or react in some way. Surely she wouldn't just sit there. But she didn't stop him. She didn't push him away or even look uncomfortable. I found it hard to breathe as a horrible realization set in. "No, this can't be," I whispered, though no one could hear me. A strange, heavy feeling came over me, almost like the time I got hit in the head by a baseball when I was 12. My vision narrowed and my chest felt like it was weighed down. I could barely breathe, barely move. I was a strong person, but at that moment I felt utterly drained, like an empty shell. If I had been lying on railroad tracks and needed only to move to avoid an oncoming train, I doubted I'd have the strength to roll away. My eyes stung as they filled with unshed tears. I watched, struggling to make sense of what was happening, feeling a deep pain and confusion that I couldn't fully understand. The light turned green. I saw Sherry playfully nudge the man's arm. She pulled his hands from beneath her skirt so she could drive, I assumed. I turned in my seat as Lyle sped away from the intersection. I watched my wife's car as it turned right onto a road that would take her back to work. She had no idea who might be watching in the big Suburban. But even if she did, she wouldn't have seen me through the dark-tinted windows. She knew I wouldn't be out at this time. My lunch hour was over half an hour ago. It seemed she didn't care about the scene she and the man had created for anyone who might see them. It didn't have to be me. It could have been anyone. Sherry was so caught up in the moment that she didn't even think to hide what she was doing. It felt like I knew her well, but maybe I didn't really know her at all. When she came home that evening, I received a quick kiss on the cheek. A couple of years ago, I would have gotten warm, loving kisses after a long day at work. Over time, those kisses had become less frequent and eventually stopped. I watched as my wife headed up the stairs. Then, I noticed something strange. I hadn't thought about it earlier when I saw her earlier. "Sherry," I called out. "What happened to your pantyhose? I know you put on a new pair this morning. Why aren't you wearing any now?" She paused before continuing down the hallway toward our bedroom, not facing me for a moment. "Oh, I got a snag in the right leg," she eventually replied. "It kept getting worse, so I just took them off." She smiled back at me, looking more closely than usual, as if she was checking if I believed her explanation. I nodded, trying to show I understood. She turned away, and I thought I saw a small look of relief on her face. "I see," I said, hoping my tone sounded playful. I hadn't meant to say anything, but a sudden mix of pain and anger made me ask about the pantyhose. Those feelings still held on to me. A mischievous thought made me want to see how far I could push her. I wondered if someone else might have pulled them off in a hurry, I said, watching her closely. She was composed, with only a slight tightening of her posture. "What brought that up?" she asked, curious. I gave her a blank look, not letting my hurt and anger show. I shrugged. "It can happen," I said. "You remember Katie, the girl I had to let go last year after she was caught with one of the guys on the loading dock? I remember her coming back from breaks without her stockings more than once." That was before I understood what was happening, of course. I shrugged and looked away, trying to appear like a man recalling a tough time. Sherry bit her lower lip for a moment before coming closer. She placed her hands gently on my sides and slowly moved them up my chest before wrapping her arms around my neck. She pulled my head down and kissed me softly for a few moments. "Sweetheart," she said when she pulled back, "you're the only man who will ever mean so much to me. I thought you knew that." Her expression was serious, and her eyes moved as she searched my face for some sign. She was trying to see how I felt, hoping I would understand her words. I guessed she was wondering how much I knew and what she could say to change my mind. It felt painful to accept. She had been hiding the truth from me, and now she was not being honest. I had hoped for something more, but I was unsure what that was. I thought that if she admitted everything, we could find a way to move forward, even if I didn't know how. When you love someone, it's hard to let go without one last try. But Sherry was waiting for me to say something. I realized I had been looking into her eyes for an answer that I had just lost hope in finding. "I know that, dear," I replied, with as much honesty as I could show. "Katie's husband left her and took the kids. She ruined her marriage and her life, all for something that wasn't worth it." My tone showed my frustration. Sherry flinched a little, but her face didn't change. "Well, she had it coming," Sherry said, "and that made it clear where we stood. My wife believed that the rules that applied to others did not apply to her. I grasped her wrists and gently moved her arms away from my neck. I looked at her calmly and then kissed her lightly. I turned her around and gave her a light tap on her back. It felt different now. It no longer mattered that she didn't appreciate playful gestures. "Now go get ready. I'll have dinner ready in 10 minutes, I told her. I turned and walked into the kitchen without looking back. At first, I didn't know what to do. I had no idea how I should react as a husband who found out his wife had been unfaithful. I admit that I couldn't focus much at work over the next week and a half. I would be busy with tasks and suddenly find myself lost in thought, not knowing how long I had been daydreaming. Several staff members asked me if something was wrong, but I always said no. No one could support me through this. I had to figure it out on my own. I could think through a few things. For one, the way he seemed at ease with my wife in public showed they had been close for a while. If they were just starting to see each other, he would likely have been more careful. This meant that Sherry had been unfaithful to me for some time. I questioned when it had all started. I couldn't recall any signs that she was being unfaithful. There were no changes in her behavior or any shifts in our daily life that stood out. In the end, though, it didn't really matter how long it had been happening. The key fact was that it was happening. Second, I was not going to accept her dishonesty. I couldn't go to work every day wondering who Sherry was spending time with. I wasn't really a church-going person anyway. There was no way I would just let it go and ignore it. That wasn't who I was. I didn't see any reason to try to save the marriage. Sherry had broken the trust we built over our 4 years together. It felt like she had done so multiple times based on what I knew, and I wasn't sure how we could ever rebuild that trust. The only thing left to do was to confront her, to get out of this situation with my mind as clear as possible. If I'd done something wrong that led Sherry to act this way, maybe she would tell me. I tried to pull my focus back from the thoughts that consumed me. I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. Pain hit me in waves, mixed with sudden bursts of anger. Neither feeling would let me focus long enough to accomplish anything. Having decided that my marriage to Sherry was over, I set myself the gloomy task of finding a way to ease my pain. The problem was, without proof of any sort, Sherry could likely take most of what we had built together. Courts in Texas are not kind to men who make unproven claims against their wives. In this day and age, wives often receive the benefit of the doubt in many situations. I pushed aside any loving feelings I had left for Sherry and locked them away in my mind. I decided I wanted my fair share of what we built together. We had some good value in the house, and our savings account was finally starting to grow. Both of us had been earning decent money for about a year, allowing us to buy good furniture and appliances. Our cars were financed, but we were close to paying them off. If I wanted my fair share of what we had, I needed to catch her in the act. I looked for a chance to find out more. On Tuesday, nearly 3 weeks after I saw Sherry with someone else, she told me she was going out on Friday night with her friends for drinks and gossip. This was something she and a few women in her group did about every 6 weeks. She mentioned Connie, Barbara, Miranda, Colleen, and Tammy would be there, but not Melissa, Sherry's close friend. Sherry seemed to find it funny that they would talk about Melissa while she wasn't there. There was nothing unusual about her going out. She had done this many times in the past. But deep down, I felt this time was different. I couldn't tell from her actions that she was planning to do anything wrong. Still, I felt uneasy and needed to check what she was saying. "Connie," I said cheerfully on my phone. Connie was a friend of Sherry's. She and her husband Art sometimes came over to our house for barbecues or dinner. "Hey there," she replied happily. Connie loved to flirt and took any chance she could. "What's up?" she asked. "Not much," I said. "I was wondering if you and Tom had any plans for tomorrow night. I thought it would be nice for the 4 of us to have dinner and play some cards." She said playfully. "Let me check my schedule." There was a brief pause, but it didn't sound like she was really checking anything. "Nope, nothing planned for that night. I'll ask Tom, but I think that sounds fun. What should we bring?" she asked. "Just bring yourselves and your smiles," I joked, trying to sound cheerful even though I felt empty inside. The happiness in my life felt gone lately. "Okay, sounds good. I will call you back when I know for sure," she said, then paused for a moment. "Oh, Ron, Tom, and I are really glad to hear that you and Sherry are doing well," she added. I felt a frown come over me as I listened. "We were a bit worried after the trip to Vegas if you two would be okay," she said more seriously. "Vegas?" I replied, feeling confused. At first, I wondered if she knew about Sherry's involvement with someone else, but I was puzzled about how she could know. The trip she was talking about was one I had missed because my boss called me at the last minute and sent me to Denver to fix an issue in our main office. Sherry went with Melissa and her husband Cal, along with Connie and Tom, and they all seemed to have enjoyed themselves. Wait, was Connie suggesting something had happened in Vegas? I had to know what was going on, even though it made me feel uneasy. "I don't get what you mean, Connie," I said, my confusion clear in my voice. There was a long pause before she replied. "Oh, it's just me being my usual scattered self," she said. "I'll ask Tom if he has plans for tomorrow, okay?" "Sure, let me know," I replied. She promised she would. I hung up the phone quickly, worried that my voice would show how I was feeling inside. About 30 minutes later, Connie called back, sounding sorry. Tom had a poker game planned at a neighbor's house. She wished it could be different, but it might be another time. I agreed, feeling disappointed they couldn't join us. I thought maybe Sherry and I should just let it go and try again later, but we both knew that wouldn't work. Now I understood two things. Something had happened with my wife in Las Vegas, and Sherry wasn't going out with her friends tomorrow night. I had to hold off on finding out more about the first while I dealt with the second. I had heard that people who cheat often think they are smarter than their partners because they manage to hide what they're doing. They begin to look down on their spouse, believing no one can figure them out. But then they make mistakes because they feel overconfident and assume no one can catch them. This was my first time facing something like this, but I saw that Sherry was making mistakes. If I hadn't seen her with that guy at the stoplight, I might have figured things out eventually. Being seen with him was a big mistake. Any of our friends could have seen them. It didn't have to be me. Another big mistake was not making sure Connie would back her up. She knew I was close with both Connie and Tom, as well as Melissa and Cal. Whatever happened in Vegas was likely common knowledge between them. One of them could have called me with the truth. These were problems she should have handled better. The third mistake was thinking I would trust her and stay home while she was out with someone else. Her fourth mistake was believing that I would tolerate her cheating. I hit my fist down on the coffee table, causing the lamp to wobble. Sherry was in the shower and didn't notice a thing. I rubbed my hand and wrist, feeling angry as I thought about my wife's betrayal of our marriage. I feared that my anger might take over my life. It felt like my jaw was always clenched and my heart raced whenever I thought about what Sherry was doing with another man. I was trying hard to hide these feelings around her, which only made my anger grow stronger. Ironically, I felt a bit relieved when I realized tonight would be their next meeting. I hated to admit it, but I was glad. Once I faced whatever was coming this evening, I planned to share what I knew with my lawyer. He was ready to take action whenever I told him to. Sherry left a little after 7, just as the sun was setting. She thought I was in the garage cleaning up, but I was actually just waiting for her to go. Now that evening had come, I was eager to get things over with and move forward. Sherry wasn't interested in what I was doing, so she didn't come outside to check on me. I figured she was just glad I was out of her way so she could prepare for her date. That was fine with me. If she had come out, she would have seen the rental car I got earlier that day. I didn't want to leave the old car out front because it might be mistaken for an abandoned vehicle. I suppose hiding the rental was a small lie. That's the problem with lying and cheating. The lies start to grow and multiply. As she walked out the door, 3 more lies were exchanged between us. I wished her a good time, and we both said we loved each other. A couple who truly loved each other wouldn't act the way we were tonight. I told myself I didn't care. Once she was far enough down the street, I opened the garage door and jumped into the rental car. I drove off, using the remote to close the garage door behind me and sped down our street to keep track of her. Ironically, I had to slow down when I saw her at a stoplight, waiting for the traffic to clear. I pulled over to the curb for a moment to avoid getting too close. Following her wasn't too difficult. Like most drivers, she hardly noticed the cars behind her, and even if she did, she wouldn't have recognized an old gray sedan. She had no idea her husband was in that car, trailing her a short distance behind. The light was still bright enough for me to recognize her car, but it was slowly getting darker. This let me turn on my headlights. If she glanced back, the glare would block her view of my face. I followed her through lighter traffic to a modest motel on the southwest side of town. I quickly parked my old car across the street. As I prepared my camera and tried to calm my nerves, I watched from the driver's side while my wife waited in her car for about 5 minutes. She seemed restless and made a few quick calls on her cell phone. Mine didn't ring. I guessed she wasn't calling me. A few minutes later, a large, dark blue SUV came down the street and pulled into the motel. I noticed a man driving it, but I couldn't see him well because he was going too fast. He parked next to my wife's car and they both got out. Shortly after, the man embraced my wife tightly and kissed her. After a moment, she patted his chest and stepped back a little. A couple of weeks ago, I bought a Nikon Dimage Z1 digital camera to help with my plan. Even though I wasn't very experienced with cameras, I could tell this one would be great for what I needed to do. I started taking pictures of my wife and the man. Although the light was dimming, the motel's lights still made it bright enough to see them. The camera's features allowed me to get clear close-ups of their interaction. I could see the details on my wife's face if I tried. I just needed to keep the camera steady enough to get good shots. I figured out that if I crouched low, rolled down the window, and rested the camera on the small bit of glass that wouldn't go down, it worked better. They didn't notice me, even though I was less than 50 yards away under a streetlight. They seemed very careless. It seemed like some people who cheat think they won't get caught. The man took out a plastic card and opened the motel room door. He and my wife went inside, and I settled in to wait for them to come out. I wanted pictures of them leaving the room to show how long they had been inside. The camera could add a date stamp to the digital pictures, and the files would show the exact date and time they were saved. I thought a computer expert could explain all this well enough for a court to understand. Even if the judge didn't like my reasons, I was sure my lawyer could find a good expert. I felt uneasy. The taste of bitterness rose in my throat as I struggled to keep my stomach calm. The longer I waited, the worse it got. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. I opened the car door and leaned out, retching onto the pavement until there was nothing left in my stomach. It became painful after that, with my stomach heaving, even though there was nothing left. When it finally stopped, I wiped my mouth, rinsed with some water, and took a sip from a bottle. Shaking with anger and sadness, I stepped away from the car and walked up and down the curb a few times to calm myself down. I glanced toward the motel door to check if anyone had come out. The room was dim, but I noticed a small, brighter spot on the lower left side of the curtain, where a slight gap let the light shine through. Curiosity took over, and after making sure no one was watching, I walked through the parking lot toward the room. As I got closer, it was clear that whoever was inside had been careless. The curtain gap was just big enough to see through. I looked around again to see if anyone was nearby, but at that moment I didn't really care if anyone saw me. This was my chance to get proof. I knelt down, lifted my camera, and aimed it through the gap in the curtains. With a few adjustments, I snapped some clear photos, hands trembling as I focused through the narrow opening. It was challenging, but I managed to capture what I needed. After a minute or two, I had the proof I'd come for, and with a heavy heart, I stepped away. He wasn't being gentle, but it seemed Sherry had a liking for a bit of roughness, as her expression showed a mix of excitement and pleasure. The camera I brought could take 6 quick pictures, so I set it up before leaving home. I pressed the button repeatedly to capture the moment. I couldn't watch them for too long. Feeling sick and in more pain than I had since my parents passed away, I sat back and tried to collect myself. I took a deep breath and shut my eyes, fighting the urge to cry. I was hurting, but everyone has their limit for how long they can feel hurt. I pushed aside my emotions, trying to lock them away behind the doors I thought I had closed earlier in the week. Suddenly, the feelings I had for her changed. I didn't feel love anymore, and I certainly didn't like her. This new distance gave me the strength to stand up without feeling dizzy or sick. Then I heard loud voices from inside the room. I recognized Sherry's voice but couldn't understand what she was saying. A moment later, I heard a loud shout that sounded like a man. I didn't know any men who showed such strong reactions, but I guessed it was possible. The sudden noise made me stand up and move away. I didn't want anyone to notice what was happening. I started to walk back to my rental car across the street, but paused by the man's car to think for a moment. I then walked down the sidewalk, looking carefully at the motel doors. I checked under the eaves and stepped away from the building to look at the roof and nearby light poles for security cameras. I spotted a spot at the far corner of the building with disconnected wires and an empty bracket, but no cameras were visible. As I crossed the parking lot, I stood next to my rental car and looked at the empty, deserted restaurant nearby. There were no cameras there. I could see some apartment buildings further down the side street, but they were quite far away. On the main road, I didn't see any businesses that looked like they would have cameras pointing this way. After making sure the cap was tightly secured on my camera lens, I placed it safely in the back seat. With a steady purpose, I returned to where my wife and the other man were parked. I took a pocket knife out of my jeans and opened it, thinking about whether what I was about to do was wise. I then shrugged and crouched down by the man's rear tires. It took more force than I expected, but soon I found the right amount of pressure to plunge the blade into the tire. I was scared that I might slip and hurt myself, but that didn't happen. The loud hiss of air escaping from the tires felt very noticeable, but no one came out to see what was happening. Encouraged by this, I checked all 4 tires on his SUV, then moved on to my wife's car, too. Looking back, I guess it was a silly act. It didn't really help anything and could have made the couple realize that someone was onto them. I decided they wouldn't think that. They were too full of themselves. I wanted to do more, but I held back. A long time ago, I might have forced my way in and confronted them directly without worry of punishment. Even further back, I could have challenged him to a fight and settled things right there. Those were considered reasonable ways for a man to save his pride back then. But now, things are different, and there aren't many options for someone in my situation. I did what I could. Feeling a bit better and not at all guilty about what I had done, I walked back to my rental car, got in, and slammed the door, not caring if anyone noticed. I had taken the first steps to deal with my unfaithful wife and regain some self-respect. There was still little left to do. Monday would come soon, and I planned to have a serious talk with my lawyer. But Sunday comes after Saturday, and I didn't think much of it. Sherry returned home before midnight, angry because someone had slashed the tires on her car outside the club. She mentioned 3 teenagers running away. Then, she complained about having to wait 3 hours for assistance. It seemed I had gone unnoticed while damaging the tires, and now someone else was being blamed. Honestly, I didn't know if her story about the teens was true, but the long wait sounded believable. I just shrugged. None of it mattered to me. I was surprised she came home that early. I thought she would be out much longer with another man. If she had to wait for any time, it meant her time with him was brief, not that it changed anything. I offered some kind words to calm her down. She soon went to bed without wanting any closeness. I understood why. The scent of cheap hotel soap on her skin was overwhelming. On Sunday afternoon and evening, Sherry became very affectionate and wanted me close. From the outside, she looked like someone who hadn't been out with another man just days earlier. She showed no signs of guilt at all. If anything, she seemed happier and more relaxed than she had in months. I had read that being overly nice can be a classic sign that a partner might be cheating. They often felt guilty, even if they didn't show it, and tried to make things right with their spouses. Earlier today, while Sherry was cooking lunch, I spoke with my lawyer. He told me to call him if I needed anything. He was ready to go. All he needed was my signature on some papers, and he would file them at the courthouse before noon tomorrow. The photos I had would help if Sherry challenged the divorce. By tomorrow afternoon, I would be a free man, in a way. The divorce would not be official for 6 months, but I would be separated from the woman who had caused me so much hurt. That evening, Sherry wore a black nightgown that she knew I liked and walked towards me on the bed. I felt unwell just thinking about being close to her after what had happened the previous Friday. I was searching for an excuse to avoid spending time with her tonight. Just the thought of being near her made my stomach churn. I sat on the bed, trying to act uninterested, but she kept trying, appearing as the loving wife wanting affection from her husband. She moved close to me, showing herself in the soft light, and I could feel her trying to engage me. Even though I wanted to resist, her touches were starting to affect me, and she seemed to enjoy that. Suddenly I made a decision. Without thinking about the consequences, I was going to give her what she wanted. It would be one last moment before we separated for good. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have realized my motives were tied to my own feelings of anger and humiliation. But at that moment, I just wanted a small bit of revenge for the pain she had caused me. I imagined a woman who didn't deserve respect, someone I could use without a second thought. I was planning to keep things subtle so she wouldn't realize my intentions right away. I let my feelings towards Sherry shift as I prepared myself. I stood up and drew her close. I leaned in to kiss her softly, our lips barely brushing before I pulled away. I did it again and again until I became more assertive. When I came back for another kiss, I found her lips waiting for me. I held her close, resting my hands on her shoulders and slowly letting them slide down her arms in a gentle, affectionate touch. She sighed softly, leaning into me, our heads close as I looked into her eyes. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth between us. She closed her eyes, moving in rhythm with me, letting herself get lost in the moment. Her hands rested softly on my arms, her face relaxed and peaceful. She leaned into me and I placed my hand on her shoulder, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I held her, feeling the quiet connection between us, letting the moment unfold naturally. Our heads came close together as I whispered her name, feeling her warmth. She responded with a soft murmur, enjoying the closeness and leaning gently against me. I held her as we stood there, feeling content, both of us lost in the shared quietness. In that moment, the world faded away, leaving just the two of us, peaceful and close, appreciating the comfort of each other's presence. I gently kissed her shoulder, pressing close, feeling her warmth and breathing in the quiet comfort of the moment. She sighed softly, and I could tell she felt at ease, letting herself relax. We sat together on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on my shoulders. I leaned in to hold her, wrapping my arms around her, sensing her steady breaths and quiet presence. Slowly, I let my hands slide down to hold her at her waist, feeling the natural rhythm of her movements. She tilted her head back slightly, and I traced a light path from her shoulder down to her arm, feeling the softness of her skin. Her breathing grew slower, and she closed her eyes, leaning into each gentle touch, relaxed and calm. I brushed her hair back, taking my time to make sure she felt cherished. Kneeling beside her, I gently held her hands, feeling the connection between us grow stronger as we simply sat in the quiet together. After a moment, I stood up, lifting her softly and helping her settle onto the bed, placing a soft kiss on her forehead as she lay down, comfortable and at ease. With care, I moved beside her, sharing one last quiet moment, letting her rest as I watched her drift off into peace and relaxation. The warmth of that shared moment stayed with me, filling me with a sense of contentment. I placed a gentle hand on Sherry's knee, feeling her respond with a slight tremble. My hands rested on her legs, offering comfort and warmth as I gave her an encouraging smile. She gripped my forearms tightly, holding on for support, and I continued to reassure her with a calm and steady presence. With a soft touch, I placed my hand gently on her shoulder, watching her breathing grow deeper and more relaxed. She leaned into the moment, her focus steady as we shared a quiet connection. As I sat beside her, her hands found mine, her grip both tender and firm. As she adjusted herself comfortably, she looked at me, her expression one of trust and openness. Her fingers wrapped around mine, grounding herself as she leaned back, eyes meeting mine. We stayed that way, steady and still, a quiet bond forming in the silence. We took our time, finding a natural rhythm in our shared moment. I held her hand and gave it a soft squeeze, a small gesture of comfort and closeness that brought a warm, peaceful feeling between us. I held her close, sensing the deep connection and trust she had in me. My hands gently rested on her shoulders, offering comfort and warmth, and I saw her begin to relax, letting go of the tension she had held. Her breathing became slower and steadier as we shared the quietness of the moment together. She leaned back slightly, her hands finding mine in a gesture that felt calm and reassuring. I placed my hand softly on her arm, feeling her relax further, her face showing peace and trust. Her hands tightened briefly on mine, a sign of the quiet comfort she felt in my presence. As she lay back, I could see the calm come over her, filling the air with a sense of peace. I leaned close, brushing a loose strand of hair back, feeling the warmth of the shared silence between us. Her body moved with gentle, slow breaths, and I could see she felt at ease. In this moment, the world outside faded, and we shared a feeling of closeness and understanding that needed no words. Her hand found mine, and I gave it a soft, steady squeeze, feeling the connection between us. As we sat in this peaceful moment together, the trust and warmth grew, filling me with a quiet contentment that lingered. I held Sherry close, offering comfort as she lay back, catching her breath. Her breathing was quick and shallow, and she clutched the bedspread, holding on tightly. I could feel the warmth between us, a quiet moment of shared peace, and she slowly began to relax, letting her hands ease their grip. As her breathing steadied, I gently touched her shoulder, watching her gradually calm down. Her body softened, settling back into the bed as her muscles released the tension they had held. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, as she sank into the moment. With care, I moved beside her, placing a comforting hand on her arm, letting her know I was there. She reached for my hand, giving it a soft squeeze, and I stayed by her side, grounding her as she relaxed fully. We shared a quiet moment in the soft light of the room, our breaths slowing until they matched in gentle rhythm. She reached up, taking my hand in hers, a small smile on her face. We lay there, simply enjoying the closeness, her hand warm in mine as we rested together, both feeling a quiet sense of trust and connection. The room was still, and I felt a calm come over us as we drifted peacefully into the night, the unspoken bond between us stronger than any words. I knew that tonight would be unforgettable for Sherry. As we shared a quiet moment, she lay beside me, catching her breath, and I felt the connection between us deepen. We were both immersed in the moment, each aware of the bond we shared. After a short rest, I moved closer, gently placing my hand on her shoulder and offering a reassuring presence. Her breathing slowed, and she looked at me with a peaceful expression, the room filled with quiet comfort. I adjusted my position, and she responded with a slight smile, relaxing fully. She reached out, taking my hand and squeezing it, showing trust and openness. Our movements became synchronized, creating a steady rhythm as we simply enjoyed each other's presence. The warmth of the room surrounded us, and her hand softly brushed my chest, each touch a reminder of our closeness. She held on tightly, grounding herself, and I matched her calm energy. Together we shared this peaceful moment, both lost in a steady rhythm that felt right. Our breaths fell into sync, our movements unhurried and filled with gentle care. We were simply there for each other, supporting one another through the silence of the night. I moved closer to Sherry, taking care to be gentle as I held her hand. I could see the tension leave her face as she relaxed, finding comfort in the closeness between us. She held on to me tightly, her breathing calming as we shared this quiet moment. We moved in rhythm, both of us finding peace in the stillness around us. With time, I eased back a little, giving her room to breathe. We lay side by side, and I reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. She looked at me with a calm expression, her gaze softened, and I could tell she felt a deep sense of contentment. Our hands remained linked, our connection strong. After a few moments, Sherry turned her head, her eyes filled with appreciation. She moved closer, resting her head gently on my shoulder, finding warmth in our shared closeness. We stayed like that, both content and quietly absorbing the calmness that filled the room. "Thank you," she murmured softly, her voice trailing off. I could sense that whatever words she had planned to say didn't matter now. We stayed in each other's presence, feeling the bond between us grow stronger. The silence around us felt complete, and I felt a sense of peace settle over us as we drifted into the comfort of the night. I didn't ask her what she meant. "All you had to do was be here with me," I said. I hoped it was unclear enough for her to think about later. She stirred a little, nodded as if she understood, and then fell into a deep sleep. I got up and took a long hot shower. After I finished, I walked down the hall to the guest room and lay down on the bed. Sherry hadn't moved when I passed our bedroom, now her bedroom. I doubted she realized I was gone. She would be annoyed when she woke up on the damp spot I had left. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I knew what the next day would bring, and even though I was anxious, I was also ready for it. I hoped it would help me move on from the troubles that had troubled me for the last month. The next morning, I was dressed and gone before Sherry woke up. I knew she'd be upset about my sudden absence, but I didn't want to be around her. It was too hard. 3 hours after she left, I returned home with a U-Haul truck. I had already taken the camera to my lawyer's office, and one of his assistants had made 2 copies of everything. The sympathy in her eyes was clear when she handed them back. I appreciated it, but felt a bit suspicious, as I didn't want to feel sorry for myself. Back home, after a couple of cups of coffee, I started packing my clothes and the few personal things I had brought into the marriage. There were not many things we had bought together that I wanted to keep. I had originally planned to take some furniture, but all I wanted was the DVD player, a 25-inch TV, and some music CDs. Nothing else seemed appealing. I backed up everything on my computer, opened the case, and took out the backup hard drive. I put it in my briefcase to use later. Before I left, I laid out a dozen prints of the photos I had taken last Friday night on her dresser. I used the computer one last time to print a note from my wife in the biggest letters I could fit. "Enjoy the memories of last night, dear. They're the last you'll have of me." This was the second silly thing I had done in 4 days, and it didn't feel good in the light of morning. But I had worked hard to say this, and I wasn't going to back down now. I taped the note to the mirror, turned around, and left what had been our bedroom, walking down the hall and out the garage door. I didn't bother locking the place up. It was no longer my responsibility. I had thought once the divorce papers were served to Sherry, our lawyers would discuss and sort out the division of our things and other assets. I thought we'd just sign some papers, see the judge, and everything would be done. I was wrong. It turned out that discussions between the lawyers took much longer than I expected and often focused on the smallest details. For example, they spent a whole lunch hour, I'm sure I paid for it, debating whether I should return the TV I had taken, or if it counted as part of my share of the home's electronics. Honestly, who cared? It felt like it was dragging on forever. In the end, we agreed to sell the house and everything in it, splitting the money equally after paying the lawyers, of course. Sherry and I would each pick out any furniture or items we especially wanted, and if the other didn't object, that item would be theirs, with a total value limit of $5,000. I didn't mind. I had already made my choices. I told my lawyer just to keep moving forward. A few weeks after the divorce papers were filed and before our first court date, I went to visit Cal and Melissa to find out how everything had started. Melissa was Sherry's best friend from college, and I had known Cal a bit. Over the years, we had all become close. It struck me that Cal and Melissa hadn't come over since our trip to Vegas, and I wondered if they could tell me anything about what had happened. When I got there, they were outside in the backyard. Cal greeted me, handed me a cold beer, and led me to sit in the shade of a big pecan tree. We sat there for a few awkward moments. So, I started, but Melissa suddenly got up and ran inside in tears. Cal and I exchanged glances, surprised. "She's a bit emotional sometimes," Cal said quietly. "I know," I replied, trying to smile despite the heaviness in the air. Melissa was always honest and straightforward, and I appreciated that about her. In some ways, she felt closer to me than my late sister had. "Ron," Cal said after a moment, "Melissa and I really feel terrible about you and Sherry splitting up, but we just didn't know how to handle it." I looked at him, unsure. I could see he realized I didn't know. "You didn't know?" he asked. I shook my head. Cal reached into the cooler beside him and got 2 more beers, giving one to me. "We were unsure if we should tell you anything when we got back from Vegas," he added, looking sad. "We thought Sherry would tell you what happened. It couldn't be kept a secret. And after a while, it seemed like she had, and the 2 of you had talked things over." "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Cal took a deep breath and spent the next 20 minutes explaining how Sherry had gotten very drunk on the first night in Vegas. She was upset because I had to cancel at the last minute, and she told the other couples that if I wasn't there when she needed me, she would find someone else. The rest of the night, Sherry drank a lot and danced with every guy who caught her attention. At some point, she and a blonde guy disappeared, even though the other couples tried hard to keep track of them in the casino. No one saw her until the next day. On Saturday afternoon, Melissa and Connie went to Sherry's room and knocked on the door until she finally answered. According to Melissa, Sherry looked a mess. The blonde guy had been in the bathroom but came out when she answered. Sherry was defensive but also drunk and sassy. The guy seemed indifferent about what happened. He left after a while, but since Sherry didn't join Melissa, Cal, Connie, and Tom that Saturday evening, they were pretty sure she had spent time with the man again. Aside from that brief meeting Saturday afternoon, they didn't see Sherry until late Sunday afternoon when she showed up at the airport to catch her flight home. They didn't know how she got to the terminal, so they couldn't say if her boyfriend brought her. They didn't really care. I didn't blame them. Melissa returned outside with red eyes and stood behind my chair, resting her hands on my shoulders. Occasionally she would gently pat me, like one might comfort a sad child. I felt like that at that moment. When Cal finished talking, I sat lost in thought. "I wish you had told me," I said after a while. I'm not sure it would have made a difference, but maybe some of the lies and the hurt could have been avoided. I sighed and bit my lip. But the damage was done, I guess. It wouldn't have mattered in the end. How did you find out about Vegas? Melissa asked softly. I leaned back to look up at her. You all just told me, I replied. She looked puzzled. Well, how did you really find out? She asked. I took her hand and gave it a gentle pat. I saw them in Sherry's car on the street a few weeks ago, and I knew something was wrong, I said, feeling frustrated. Both of their faces went pale. They winced with sympathy. Oh, you poor thing, Melissa said. What a terrible way to find out. I shrugged. I'm not sure there is a good way, Lissa, I said, but it's over now. I looked at the grass by my feet to hold back the tears that had suddenly filled my eyes. Sherry had come over a few days ago to tell them about the divorce. Melissa said Sherry was very upset that Melissa wouldn't support her. Sherry called it a big mistake. When Melissa called her some harsh names, Sherry had stormed off. That was typical for Sherry, blaming everyone but herself and the other person involved. Cal, Melissa, and I talked for about an hour more before I left. Their little baby needed care, and I wouldn't have added much to their dinner, even though they really wanted me to stay. 3.5 months into the divorce talks, the issue of the pictures I took came up. Sherry was worried I might share them online. I thought that suggestion might be useful, so I looked for a way to share them. I joked about sending copies to everyone at Sherry's office and her friends, even though I didn't plan to follow through with that. But it got us talking again. It would have been complicated legally if I had gone through with my threat. For one, I took those pictures without permission from the motel or the people in them. I told my lawyer that I'd go for it if something didn't change soon. The next day, Sherry's lawyer brought up how to divide the house and offered me 60% of the sale price if I would hand over all copies of the pictures. I said no. After some time, they offered me 55% if I would only keep one copy and promise not to share any online. Sherry also asked for a private meeting with just the two of us. I countered with 60%, keeping one print and only 30 minutes with her. We eventually settled on 60% of the house, 2 sets of the pictures, one for me and one for Sherry, no digital copies, and a 1-hour private meeting. They dropped their court motions and agreed to a no-fault divorce as soon as possible. The court recognized that Sherry and I were no longer living together as a married couple while waiting for the final divorce. Texas doesn't have legal separation, so this was the best we could do. I was okay with that. The sale of our home and belongings could move forward, and the waiting period for the divorce would not be delayed. In another couple of months, all of this would be finished. In the meantime, I worked hard to keep my job from being affected by the divorce. In fact, I found comfort in my work. I was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave that night. Maybe because he noticed my renewed commitment to the company, the boss made me the temporary head of the R&D branch. He handed me all the issues to handle, but didn't offer me a pay raise. I didn't mind too much. I just made sure that the troubles in my personal life didn't affect my work. I got there about 10 minutes early. I had hoped for slow traffic so I could arrive late, but that didn't happen. The meeting with Sherry was set to take place in a spare office in my lawyer's suite. I was taken into that office and shown to the big chair behind the desk. It was supposed to have a strong effect on Sherry, putting her at a disadvantage. One of my lawyer's helpers, a young woman who had been kind when I started the divorce process, adjusted my tie and brushed off some imaginary lint. As I sat there, she leaned in close. I could smell her perfume, and if I had looked down, I would have seen more than I intended. When everyone else left the room to greet my wife, she kissed my forehead impulsively, told me to hang in there, and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. As she stood up to leave, she turned back and smiled before she walked out. Once everyone was gone, I moved to a chair at the small conference table by the big desk. I felt no need for props or barriers. My wife had been unfaithful, I found out, and I was ready to end things. I didn't see it as more complicated than that. When Sherry entered, she saw me calmly arranging photos of her and her companion together on the hotel bed on the table. I was trying to line them up neatly, but struggled as they slid on the slick surface. I kept working while Sherry settled in. When I finally looked up, I noticed a flush across her face. She was an attractive woman, not traditionally beautiful, but definitely more than just pretty. I knew that beneath her bulky sweater and knee-length dark blue skirt, she had a captivating figure. I gazed at the face I had loved for over 6 years, 4 of which we had spent as a married couple. She had been warm and loving for most of that time, but now I couldn't remember when the woman I once knew had faded away. "You really got me, didn't you?" she said bitterly, interrupting my thoughts. Her expression showed irritation, something I had come to expect from her more often lately. "I bet you're so proud of yourself, aren't you?" I scoffed. A breath of air moved some pictures, and I pushed them back into place with my finger. "No," I said softly. "You did this to yourself," I told her. I looked up and saw her staring at me. She opened her mouth, probably to say something hurtful, but I spoke first. "And no, I'm not proud of finding out you were unfaithful. I thought the person I married would never betray me. Why would I be proud to learn otherwise?" Her anger faded, and she sat there looking blank for a moment. I raised my arm and checked my watch, trying to make it clear I was waiting. "I heard you wanted to talk, so let's do that. We have about 55 minutes left." I leaned back in my chair, tired of the pictures. Sherry made an effort to focus on me and not the images. She took a deep breath. "Ron, Whoa, hold on," I interrupted. She pulled back, surprised by my tone. "You don't get to call me honey or anything like that," I said. "You lost that right when you made those choices in Vegas." She flinched and couldn't meet my gaze. Instead, she stared at the wall behind me. "I didn't mean to cross any lines," she finally said. "Okay," I replied. "Just so we're clear." She nodded. "Ron." She paused, looking at me, probably waiting for me to object again. "Ron," she continued, "I'm really sorry about all this. I never intended to hurt you. Please believe that." "I don't have to believe anything," I shot back. "Why would you think it wouldn't hurt me if you were unfaithful? It makes no sense." She looked at me quietly for a long moment. "I never wanted you to find out," she said softly. "If you didn't know, you wouldn't have been hurt." I let out a scoff. "What? If I didn't find out, it wouldn't matter? Sherry, either you aren't thinking straight or you think I am. Our friends told me you were dancing too closely with another guy and then disappeared. They couldn't find you until the next day. That guy was in your room with you and you didn't even try to hide it. Did you really think I wouldn't find out eventually?" She sat in silence for a moment, then asked suddenly, "So why didn't you stop me?" "What?" I replied. "I wasn't there, Sherry." She shook her head. "When we got back, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you stop me from being with him again?" She was getting upset, but I didn't understand what she meant. "Why didn't you fight for me?" "You're supposed to care about me," she said suddenly. I felt confused. It was already difficult without her speaking in riddles. "Sherry," I replied tiredly, "I had no idea what you were thinking. How could I know what you wanted?" Then it hit me. "Oh, Sherry, Melissa and Cal didn't say anything about Las Vegas until I saw you with that guy." She flinched at my mention of him, but I wasn't in the mood to be nice. "Do you want to know how I found out?" I asked boldly. She nodded, a small tear forming in her eye. "I saw you with that guy while I was waiting in a van at a stoplight," I said bluntly. "He was too close to you and I was shocked." Her body language changed. She went from being defensive to looking sad and defeated. I let my words sit with her. "I'm so sorry you saw that, Ron," she finally responded. "I'm sorry I let it happen. I'm sorry about everything." "You didn't seem sorry at that moment," I told her. "In fact, it looked like you were enjoying yourself," I said, trying to lighten the mood a bit. She winced but then sat up straight. "I came here to be honest with you, and I will be," she said. "I liked it," she admitted. "I shouldn't have, but I did. But not as much as if it were someone else," she added. "But it wasn't just someone else, Sherry," I replied gently, "and it definitely wasn't me. It was him, and he had no right to be that close." I slammed my hand on the table, making a loud noise that echoed against the law books around us. "I had a special commitment with you, Sherry," I declared. "It's called marriage. No one else had any right to be that way with you but me." I leaned back, feeling shaking with frustration. I fought to stay calm. The pictures on the table slid around as I tried to collect myself. To keep my hands busy, I started stacking them neatly. "I'm sorry, Ron," she said after a moment. "You're right, I shouldn't have been with that man. I don't have any excuses." For the first time today, I agree, I interrupted, cutting off her explanation. Yeah, she replied. I know. She took a deep breath. Ron, would it change anything if I told you that after we took those pictures, I told him I wasn't going to see him again? I looked up from my pile of photos. She sought my gaze. I shrugged. No, not really, I said calmly. She looked shocked, as if she thought she had said something important. Sherry, you cheated on me in Las Vegas in front of our friends. When you got home, you didn't come to me to talk about it. Instead, you went to see him many times here in our town. You didn't stop when you returned. What's the saying, what happens in Vegas, stays in Vegas? Well, that didn't apply to you, did it? You kept going and going like that bunny in the commercials. You know, Sherry, people say that cheating becomes easier each time. It looks true in your case. You had no trouble finding times to meet your blonde guy. I doubt you would have ever stopped if I hadn't caught you with those pictures and then filed for divorce. I looked up from the photos spread in front of me. You told me you wouldn't see him again. But to be honest, I don't believe you, I said firmly. I think you're lying. It's true, she replied sharply. Just after we went into the room, I told him it was our last time. I had already decided to stop seeing him. I felt guilty and wanted to end it. She reached for one of the photos and held it up. Look at this, she insisted. He was being rough with me because I said I wouldn't be with him again. A bit later, I managed to break away and kicked him. I shook my head. I didn't want to see what she was showing me, and it didn't really matter. It looks like you were enjoying yourself, I said, raising my hand to stop her from arguing. But let's assume you're telling the truth, I leaned forward. If you wanted to stop seeing him, why didn't you just call him and say so? Why did it have to end that way? She looked down. I know, it was wrong, but no, Sherry, I don't want to hear it. Even if I tried to believe you, I can't see how you would stop while your secret life was still hidden from me. You might mean it now. Maybe you did stay away for a little while, but you'd have gone back to him or found someone new the first time you were upset with me or things didn't go your way. Eventually, you'd have felt the urge again and used it to get back at me for every real and imagined problem we had, right? Wasn't that part of what you were doing, Sherry? I felt anger rising again and tried to calm down. I slouched back in my chair, trying to appear calm. Sherry was crying again. You don't have to talk to me like that, she said quietly. I'm your wife. I looked away, feeling frustrated. Not for much longer, I replied harshly. We're separated, the courts have confirmed it, and all we need to do is wait another 52 days for it to be final. And besides, I talk about people in a very different way than I would talk to a loyal partner if I ever have one again. Tears began to flow down my face. Ron, I want to apologize for what I've done. Can't you see that? I'm really sorry. I shook my head, feeling exhausted by the whole situation. Okay, Sherry, you're sorry. I'm sorry too. Everyone involved in this tough situation feels sorry. But what does that change? We sat in silence for a moment. Sherry, I said softly, you've taken away something very important to me. I pointed to my chest. There's a big emptiness inside me where I used to have the image of a woman I loved more than anything, a woman I trusted deeply, someone I could rely on when the world felt against me. You were my friend, someone I could share anything with. You were the one I imagined spending my life with, the only one I wanted to be close to. You took all that away and I can't get it back, I told her. My voice quivered and I needed to pause. Sherry was crying even more. Ron! I cut her off. Sherry, I said slowly, you've hurt me so much by being with someone else, betraying me, betraying yourself, and betraying our marriage. I took a deep breath. I just hope whatever you gained from it was worth the damage to our relationship, especially since I heard that the man you were with is having problems too. That was true. An investigator who worked with my attorney found a garage that had picked up 2 cars with slashed tires from a motel, took them for repairs, and then returned them. The record driver remembered a very upset woman and a quiet man with those cars. Each report had the license plate numbers, and once he had that, it was easy for the investigator to discover the man's name and some personal details. When my attorney told me who he was, I found a number for his home and spoke to his wife. She was furious when I shared what I knew. It didn't surprise me that she also filed for divorce. Interestingly, there were actually 3 teenagers who ran away from the motel when Sherry left her room. They might have been up to no good, but I knew they weren't responsible for the tires. I watched my wife sob for a while. I wanted to hold her close, but she felt like a stranger to me now. "Can you tell me why you did it?" I asked. It took her a long time to stop crying and gather herself. Melissa and Cal shared some of the things she said in Las Vegas with me. I wanted to ask her if she could tell me more. "I don't know, Ron," she said, sounding upset. "It felt like a whole different place there. From the moment I got off the plane, it didn't seem real. Then I drank too much. The lights were so bright, it was like they mesmerized me. You weren't there, and I was angry you didn't come with me. Then he talked to me kindly, saying it was sad I was alone. After a while, I just gave in, Ron." Her voice broke at the end. I looked at her and felt a strong sense of disappointment. "Well, that's just—" I struggled to find the right words to express my feelings, but they didn't come. "None of that is an excuse," I finally shouted. "First, I had to go to Denver to fix a big mistake in the power delivery system. If I didn't go, I would have lost my job, and then we couldn't pay for that big house you wanted a couple of years ago. I wanted to be with you in Vegas, but I couldn't. Don't you think I would have if I could? Then there's the drinking. Who told you to drink too much in the first place? Are you a child that needs someone to take a drink away? Come on. You should not have been drinking if you can't control who you let get close to you when you do. Bright lights? Mesmerized? What does that even mean, Sherry? Should everyone treat you like you have a problem because you're distracted by the pretty lights? Give me a break." I took a deep breath and leaned on the armrest of my chair. Something else she said made me angry again, and I leaned in closer to her. "And you said he was talking to you nicely. That's something, isn't it? You're a beautiful woman, Sherry. Of course, men will notice you. So what? Who told you it was okay for a married woman to let someone else comfort you and tell you that it was awful your husband wasn't there? That's what he did, wasn't it? He made me look bad for not being there for you." She nodded, wiping her face with a tear-soaked tissue. "Yeah," I said, feeling disgusted. "And you accepted it, didn't you?" I shook my head in disappointment. "Listen, Sherry, you talked about drinking. You're married. That means you're supposed to act responsibly. A married person should avoid situations that could lead to trouble. I mean that seriously. A married person needs to treat their relationship with care, like someone who cannot drink alcohol at all. But you didn't. The first time you danced with him too close, the first time you let him hold your arm in a way that felt possessive, it was like breaking a promise you made to yourself. Our marriage vows said we would be true to each other, Sherry. How could you forget that? Do you really think I'm so unappealing, so bad at being close that I could never find someone like you? Every time I travel, I have chances with other women. I go on trips 7 or 8 times a year. Each place has a woman, someone in the office, a waitress, or someone at the hotel bar. Maybe just a girl I see in the hallway. There are always women around, but you know what? I've never acted on it. I've been approached a lot this year, but I didn't even think twice about any of them because I had you at home. Guess I was wrong to trust you, I said. If only I had known. I shook my head in disappointment. The room was quiet except for Sherry's quiet crying. She sat there, hunched over, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hide her tears. I wasn't sure why she wanted to talk, but I seemed to be doing most of it. After a long pause, I spoke again. You should never have let him touch you at all, Sherry. The moment he did, you lost something special between us. Each time he crossed a line, it was like taking a step further away from our marriage. What's the point in talking about it? Suddenly, my anger faded. I sank back in my seat, trying to calm myself. I don't know what else to say, Sherry. You've ruined something truly beautiful. Now all I feel is hurt, and that isn't going away. I loved you completely. I still do, I guess, but I haven't figured out how to turn those feelings on and off, like you have. Ron, Sherry said quietly, if you can still love me, we could try again. She stopped when she saw me shaking my head. But we shared a special moment just before you left me, she said, her voice filled with confusion. Not really, I replied sharply. What we shared that night wasn't the love you think it was. I wanted you to remember me when I was gone. I regret doing that. It was unfair and selfish of me. I'm sorry. Sherry looked surprised and then sad. She had hoped I would want to be with her again. We sat quietly, watching each other for a while. "I can't try again," I finally said, remembering what she asked. "I have nothing left to give, Sherry," I continued. "I can't trust what you say. I know you've been dishonest since you got involved with someone else. You were misleading me every day, and that is really unfair to someone who cares about you. I can't trust you anymore, Sherry. I can't picture ever feeling safe with you again. I can't live like that." I sighed and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," I said, thinking out loud. "It seemed like we were good together. If I didn't make you happy, you must be a great actress. I never saw so many false moments in one night, if that was the case." I paused, trying to understand my thoughts. "You know, Sherry, I know I'm not perfect. I sometimes miss when you're unhappy, and I don't always catch your hints quickly enough. There are moments when I don't know what you want, especially when you're upset. But I've never completely shut myself off from you. I try to be kind, even if I don't always get it right. I only watch one football game a week to have extra time with you on weekends. I take you out when we can afford it. I bring you flowers sometimes. I know I could do more, but I do try. I know I'm not always the partner I want to be, but what did I do to deserve this?" "Nothing. Nothing at all, Ron," Sherry replied quickly. "It was just me. I did something mean, foolish, and hurtful. I'm really sorry for hurting you. I feel terrible about what I did. I wish I could undo it, but I can't. I can't change the past." She went quiet, maybe too drained to cry anymore. "I can't stop wondering, Sherry," I said quietly. "When did you decide it was okay to be with someone else? What made you think that was the answer to the problems we had?" "I never decided to do any of that, Ron," she replied softly. "I'm really sorry. If I had been in charge, I would have made different choices. This mistake just happened. I didn't want it. I wasn't looking for it," she said. That was it for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up in my chair and started to gather the pictures, putting them into a neat pile. I was tired of all the excuses. "No, it didn't just happen," I said firmly. "Come on, Sherry. You can't tell me you were just walking through the casino that night and suddenly found yourself in that situation. No way, that's not true. You let this happen. Let's be honest. You made it happen after you got back home. And honestly, you wanted it. You may not have looked for it in Vegas, but you certainly did here in town. Please take some responsibility for this, Sherry. This wasn't some sudden surprise. You made a choice, you enjoyed it, and you kept choosing it. Plain and simple." She just stared at me, looking shocked. "And this wasn't a mistake either," I added. "A mistake is when you grab a can of soup and end up with the wrong one. This is much bigger than that." "And I guess this is how it has to be, Sherry," I told her. "I can't be with someone I can't trust. They don't make chastity belts anymore. And I wouldn't use one if they did. If I have to worry every time I step away from you that you might be with someone else, then I'd rather end this. You can be with whoever you want for all I care." I put the pictures into my jacket pocket and stood. "I have nothing more to say, Sherry, and our time to talk is almost up. Do you have anything to say?" She stood and looked me in the eye across the table. "Just one thing, Ron, and then you can go if that's what you want. I thought I could explain what happened and see if we could find a way through this." I pulled one picture from my coat pocket and held it up. "Sherry, I don't need an explanation. This one photograph tells me everything. If it didn't, what Cal and Melissa told me would have filled in the gaps later anyway. I don't understand what you're trying to say. Don't you see? When you went to your room in Las Vegas with that man and closed the door, you shut me out of your life. You ended our marriage with that one choice. Everything else is just more confusion on top of it. You can't explain this away. The truth is the truth, and nothing can change that. I don't know what else I can say. How about if I say there is no explanation that will change anything? Does that make it clearer?" She seemed to find a bit of strength. Somehow she ignored what I had just said. She didn't comment on it. "Ron, I love you, and I will always love you. I want you to remember that," she said. "I've been selfish and made mistakes. I won't ever stop loving you. Can you understand that, Ron?" I nodded. I shrugged. I didn't doubt she thought she understood, standing with me in that room. But it felt like a shallow kind of love if it allowed her to do what she had done. I adjusted my jacket and turned away from the woman who had been my wife. Ron, I'm sorry. I know, I muttered, avoiding her gaze. I didn't say anything else, and neither did she. Sherry didn't reach out to me as I walked out the door. I was relieved. Deep inside, I still loved her as much as I did when we married. But love couldn't fix this. She had disrespected our marriage and me. There was nothing left to save, and it was better to move on. I closed the door firmly but quietly behind me. 2 days after my difficult talk with Sherry, I learned why I was not made the permanent director of research and development. They offered me a choice, that job or a position as deputy assistant director of Western operations with our parent company. This office was based in Denver, but I would be away for up to 3 months each year, visiting all our locations between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. I accepted their offer almost immediately. I wanted to get away, and that was now very important to me. I would stay on until someone from St. Louis came in and got familiar with the work. Meanwhile, the company was going to bring people from various locations to brief me on their roles and how they fit into the larger company. There would be presentations, video calls, and one-on-one meetings, anything I needed to understand my new duties. The pay increase would bring my salary into 6 digits, but it didn't make me as happy as I expected. There was no one to share the news with, just a few close friends. I called Melissa and Cal a few minutes after I left the boss's office. Melissa was home and very excited about my promotion, but then her mood changed because I was moving away. We talked about going out for dinner on Friday night, and I agreed. We had a nice time, but it felt different. About 2 weeks later, the first person who was going to meet with me arrived in town. Miss Webster was a buyer for some of our other businesses, and she wouldn't be my supervisor when I got to Denver. She worked from Sacramento and reported to someone else. However, she had all the information I needed about what they did for the main company, and she even had a ready PowerPoint presentation on her laptop. She was returning from a trip to the Carolinas and decided to stop by Texas on the way. It was Friday afternoon, and I had to meet with her. Miss Webster was in her 30s, but it was hard to tell her exact age. She wore a dark gray business suit and had a serious look on her face when I first met her. She shook hands with me firmly and walked down the hall beside me with long strides. She was shorter than I was, but you wouldn't know it from the way she moved. We went to a conference room set up for presentations. When we got there, she looked around and chose a smaller room instead of the one with all the fancy projectors. She set her laptop on a table and began working on her slides. Sitting at the corner of the table with the laptop between us, she explained her division's operations and the company as a whole. I think I surprised her with some questions I had about how things worked, who did what, and why they did it that way. She didn't have answers for a couple of my questions and noted them down to check later. Our meeting was very productive, and by the end, I had a good understanding of how her division fit into the larger company. Afterward, we stepped out of the presentation room into a nearly empty office filled with cubicles. Both of us looked at our watches at the same time and were surprised at how late it had become. "I'm sorry, Miss Webster," I said sincerely. "I didn't realize we were in there for so long." I smiled at her. I think I'll have to credit that to such a well-prepared and knowledgeable speaker. For the first time, she smiled brightly at me. Up to then, her smile had been professional and distant, rarely reaching her eyes. This new smile was much better. "Karen," she said with emphasis. I looked around and saw only a few people waiting for the elevators, all of them men. "No, me, I'm Karen," she said, now grinning warmly at me. I was taken aback. I could feel warmth rising from my collar and wrapping around my ears. "Oh," I said. "I'm sorry about that. I guess I wasn't paying much attention." "And I'll blame the late hour on my really smart boss," she added before I could say more. Her smile and kind words along with her hand on my arm made me feel better. "That's very nice of you to say. I really appreciate it." I wasn't stumbling over my words, but I was far from fluent. "Not at all," she replied, patting my arm before letting her hand fall to her side. The spot where her hand had been felt suddenly empty, and I wished she would put it back. "I meant it," she said, her lovely smile lighting up her face again. "Well, thanks. Can I give you a ride to your hotel or to the airport? I should have asked sooner." "Actually, I haven't checked into a hotel yet," she said lightly. "I went straight from the airport to here and haven't gotten to the hotel yet." I felt bad for not realizing that. "Then let me at least take you to where you're staying. I offered. You have a reservation, right? She nodded and told me where it was. Great! Let me lock up my office and I'll drive you over there. Does that sound okay? She nodded again, smiling, which warmed me, even in the chilly air of the office building. It turned out that Karen hadn't picked up her luggage when she arrived, so we made a quick stop at the airport. We found her 2 suitcases that had been put aside because she hadn't retrieved them right away. The woman who helped us looked a bit annoyed, as if there was a rule about picking up luggage immediately. Karen and I exchanged kind words and compliments with the woman, making her smile by the time we left. Once we were out of sight, we laughed together about how well we had turned her mood around. It felt nice to share a laugh with someone again. After getting my car from the parking lot, I drove Karen to a nice hotel downtown and walked her to the front desk. Her reservation was confirmed, and her room was ready. I didn't really need to accompany her. She had everything under control. But I helped carry her luggage in so I wouldn't feel awkward. Once all the paperwork was done and she was ready to head to her room, I hesitated, wondering if I should just leave. I felt like I was back in high school. Karen, if I'm being too forward, please let me know, but I accept, she said, surprising me with her honesty. Just dinner, or... I stared at her for a moment, unsure. It had been years since I had asked someone out, and it felt easier than I remembered. How about dinner, and then maybe we can go somewhere for a quiet drink and a little dancing? I suggested. She stepped closer and gave me a gentle kiss on my cheek. Pick me up at 8? She asked, stepping back. I'll be here, I promised. She smiled nicely and walked away, leading the bellboy toward the elevators. The spot where she'd kissed me felt warm, almost glowing in the late Texas afternoon. I walked past my car and had to turn back a short distance to find it. I couldn't get reservations at the restaurant where I hoped to take Karen, so we chose a place called Fisher's. Over the years, the name had been shortened, and now it was simply Fisher's. It was a dinner club with great food served until 10 p.m. After that, they opened a wall that hid more tables and a large dance floor, turning the space into a lively nightclub until 2 a.m. Diners could enjoy their meals and stay at the same table if they wanted to. However, if they wanted to dance, they had to weave through other tables, which some found tricky. Others preferred to sit near the dance floor. It was a nice spot for adults, and my wife and I had gone there many times when we were together. When I arrived at her hotel, I called up and Karen came down to the lobby. I'm sure my mouth dropped open when the elevator doors opened, and I watched her walk toward me. She wore a soft green evening dress with thin straps, and the bodice hugged her gently. The skirt flowed down to just above her knees in front and below the knees in back. It looked like it had layers of delicate fabric. Her dark blonde hair fell nicely to her shoulders. She walked up to me, wearing heels that made her eye level with me. She had lovely eyes, too. "You're beautiful," was all I could manage to say. It was sincere, even if it wasn't very fancy. I felt a bit shy, but maybe that was okay. She felt a little shy, but didn't seem bothered by the compliment. She took my arm and pressed it to her side like it was something natural. "Shall we go?" she asked. "Honestly," I replied, still feeling bashful. "I could spend all night just admiring you." I gave her a smile, hoping it looked real. She smiled back and gave me a soft kiss near my ear. "But I'm hungry," she said. "You need to feed me." I nodded, smiling at her like a fool. "Then let's go, madame," I said, waving my hand toward the sliding glass doors that led outside. She nodded, and we walked out together, arms linked. I don't even remember passing through the doors. "This is a lovely place," Karen said quietly, leaning in to speak. She looked around, smiling at people who noticed her, taking in the lively atmosphere. Others noticed her too. I wasn't a regular here, but some people recognized me. They seemed curious about the attractive young woman with me. Many of the single men were gazing at Karen with admiration. I understood why. She was stunning. And she was with me. "It is," I agreed. I hesitated but decided to share what was on my mind. "You're probably getting a lot of looks because I used to bring my wife here sometimes," I told her, trying to sound casual. She looked at me for a moment, then leaned in closer, touching my finger where my wedding ring used to be. "So, what's going on?" she asked. "That's just a reminder of a marriage I thought was solid," I replied slowly. "In just a couple of weeks, I'll have the final papers," I added. We've been apart for a while, just waiting for the required time to pass." "What happened?" Karen asked steadily. She looked straight into my eyes without judgment, but also without pity. I gave her the brief version. "Well, we had been drifting apart for the past year, and I'm not entirely sure why. She has her job, and I seem to be starting a new path I didn't expect. Maybe we were just growing apart without noticing," I reflected. "Anyway, she went to Vegas with some friends, and I couldn't go last minute due to a problem at work. She says she was upset and ended up having a little too much fun." "There was a man, which led to trouble," I said. "A one-time thing?" Karen asked. I shook my head. "No, she spent the whole weekend with him. Some friends told me later that she didn't know he was from here. When she returned, he started calling her, and things continued from there. I'm not sure how many times it happened, but it went on for about 6 weeks before I spotted her on the street with someone I didn't like much." "I understand," was all Karen said. I thought she sounded a bit judgmental. Later, she told me she hadn't meant it that way, but at the moment, I didn't know that. I just couldn't let something like that go. I'm sorry, but I'm a bit strict when it comes to trust. What happened in Vegas was tough enough. I tried to think if I could have moved past the first issue out there, but I just don't know. I definitely couldn't handle them continuing to do it back home," I shared. She nodded, looking thoughtful. She moved a bit closer to me, put her hand on my wrist, and spoke softly so no one could hear us. We talked for a long while, starting with my failed marriage, but we quickly changed the topic. There were many brighter things to discuss. I learned that she was 31, a year and a half older than me, and we joked about her being the older woman. She had also been divorced more than 10 years ago, so she understood my struggles. After her divorce, she worked as a waitress while going to night school for her business degree. Later, she landed a job in a big office. Despite the expectations for women to advance in certain ways, she chose not to do that. Now, she led a team of 26 buyers who traveled the country to find what the company needed. We shared stories about our lives and discovered we both loved Tom Clancy novels, music from the 60s and 70s, and realistic paintings. I warned her that I wasn't a great dancer, but with her, I felt good on the dance floor. I managed not to step on her toes even once. On the way back to our table, I told her I didn't understand why she ever wore pants that hid her lovely legs. Her legs were stunning. She was tall, and her dress highlighted that. Her tanned legs were bare. Without stockings, she didn't need any. They seemed impressively long and beautifully shaped from her slim ankles up to her slender thighs. She mentioned that business was one thing, but this was something different. I smiled and agreed. This definitely wasn't about work. She looked at me closely, and I believe she saw my honesty because she leaned in and kissed me lightly on the lips. I was caught off guard, but really happy. She said she needed to step away for a moment. She took her purse, smiled at me, and walked off. I watched her leave, captivated. How do women sway that way while walking? I didn't know that Melissa and Cal were at Fisher's that night, too. Years later, Melissa told me that she had gotten up from her table to follow Karen when she saw her leaving mine. In the restroom, she found Karen at the vanity, touching up her makeup. They exchanged small talk, and Melissa noticed Karen casually removing her earrings and chatting with a few other women who were there. Karen had then made a comment, hinting at her excitement for the evening. Melissa, in surprise, mentioned that I was married, which led to a short conversation. Karen wanted to confirm that I was, in fact, separated and close to finalizing a divorce. Once Melissa reassured her, they laughed and continued chatting a bit more, finding a surprising sense of camaraderie. When Karen returned to our table, she was smiling quietly, looking cheerful, and didn't explain her amusement. It wasn't necessary. Just seeing her happy and in good spirits was enough for me. Her attention toward me, warm and genuine, made my heart race a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. My wife and I hadn't shared an evening like this in so long, and I realized it was the first time I hadn't thought about Sherry that night. As the evening ended and we headed toward the door, I spotted Melissa and Cal also leaving. I made my way through the crowd to catch up and introduced Karen, only to learn they had already met. We chatted briefly, exchanged quick goodbyes, and each went our separate ways. I didn't understand Cal's restlessness at the time, thinking he was simply eager to leave. Only later did I understand that his hurried movements were due to Melissa's secret note to him, a small reminder tucked away in his pocket. Once outside in my car, Karen sat close to me. When I glanced over, her bright smile met mine, and we shared a warm, soft kiss. At first it was light, just a gentle greeting, but as we became more comfortable, it grew deeper and more meaningful. My hand rested on her arm, feeling the warmth and softness of her skin, and she leaned in, matching my closeness. We shared a quiet moment together, letting the calm of the evening settle around us. In that stillness, there was a sense of connection that needed no words. We pulled away from our long kiss, both of us catching our breath. I looked into her eyes, searching for answers. "If you don't want this to continue," she whispered, "you need to tell me now, Ron." It was the first time she said my name like that. "Is there someone special at home?" I asked quietly. She shook her head gently. "No one," she replied softly. "Then let's keep going," I said simply. She placed a hand on the back of my neck and drew me closer for another kiss. Our lips moved together as my fingers gently explored. I was surprised to feel her smooth skin. Karen started to pull down my pants, and we kissed and explored each other until some loud comments around us interrupted us. We pulled back, smiling like we had been caught doing something naughty. "We have a space," she whispered in my ear. "We have an apartment," I said. "But the space is closer." "Drive quickly?" she asked with a giggle. "Absolutely," I replied. I started the car, and we were off in no time at all. On the way, Karen snuck her hand into my shorts, making me feel a rush of excitement. Before we reached the hotel, she lowered herself on the seat beside me. I could tell she didn't want to rush anything, wanting to enjoy the moment. She wanted to bring me pleasure, and it seemed she saw no reason to wait until we were in private. I appreciated that openness. It felt honest and fresh, compared to the secrets and hurt I had dealt with in my marriage. It was a good feeling, one that made the trip seem to fly by. Once we arrived at the hotel, Karen locked the door and turned to me with a playful smile. She skillfully undid a couple of buttons on her dress, letting it fall gracefully. I took in the sight, amazed. She had an aura about her, and it was clear she knew it. She glanced down at the way I reacted and smiled. "This is going to be fun," she said, and I couldn't help but agree. With confidence, she approached me, her arms wrapping around my neck. Our lips met again, and we shared a deeper kiss that felt intense. We were both breathing heavily, reluctant to pull away just to catch our breath. As my hand found its way to her side, I noticed she was different from my wife. The change felt refreshing. On her best days, I'd joke with Karen, telling her she'd earned a solid B, and she'd laugh, knowing it was all in good fun. She had a lively spirit and always took it in stride. Her warm and cheerful energy always filled the room, making every moment feel a bit brighter. As we held each other close, I gently rested my hand on her back, feeling her lean into me with trust and comfort. Her laughter had softened, and the shared silence between us became a peaceful connection. My hand moved from her back to her shoulder, where I felt her breathing steady, matching the calm rhythm of the moment. "Should we skip the small talk and enjoy the evening?" I murmured quietly. Karen laughed softly, her usual humor showing through. She had a straightforward way of speaking her mind, something I admired. After years of quieter, more reserved conversations, this openness felt refreshing. Standing together, I wrapped my arm around her, making her feel secure as we shared this time. Karen looked at me, her eyes warm and inviting, and I knew that this night was special for both of us. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed like that, close and content, enjoying the quiet and each other's company. After a while, Karen rested her head back, taking a long, deep breath, her expression full of calm and satisfaction. We stayed together for a few more peaceful moments before she finally relaxed fully, the warmth of the moment lingering between us as we both enjoyed the stillness. I slowed my hand, letting each gentle touch linger, giving Karen time to breathe and regain her energy. Her hands moved lightly over my shoulders and arms, seeking something to hold on to as she steadied herself. We found a comfortable rhythm, our movements calm and natural. I could see her relax, her breathing settling as she leaned into my shoulder for support. Her whispered words drifted to me, her voice filled with appreciation. I held her close, providing the support she needed, both of us sharing a quiet laugh together. Her head rested back, a peaceful smile spreading across her face. "Hold me up for a bit?" she asked with a soft laugh. I nodded, giving her the steady support she needed to stand and regain her strength. "I'm probably not very steady right now," she said, laughing again, her eyes bright with humor. "I've got you," I assured her, keeping her close as she leaned against me, both of us feeling relaxed and at ease. We shared a smile and leaned in, sharing a gentle, lasting kiss that left us both feeling calm and connected. I felt a bit self-conscious, though there was no one around except Karen, who was entirely focused on the moment. She looked up at me, her smile bright with a hint of amusement. It was clear she was happy, and I felt a mix of warmth and excitement in her gaze. Her attention made me feel connected in a way I hadn't in a long time. Her laughter was soft and comforting, and we exchanged glances that made the moment feel full of lightness and ease. She reached for my hand, and I held hers firmly, sharing a simple, quiet closeness that didn't need words. We stood there, letting the moment linger. Karen's presence brought a calm I hadn't realized I'd been missing. She leaned her head against me, and we shared a peaceful silence, the kind that speaks volumes without a single word. After a few moments, she looked up at me, her expression both playful and thoughtful. "Let's make this a memory," she said softly, her tone warm with sincerity. I pulled her close, our laughter blending together as we embraced, feeling the shared joy of the moment. Together we shared a gentle, unhurried kiss, letting the world around us disappear for a while. It was a moment of genuine connection, and we both knew it was something special. I held Karen close, steadying her as she leaned against the wall, our shared closeness bringing a deep sense of connection. She looked up at me, a joyful gleam in her eyes, and we shared a smile that needed no words. The intensity between us settled into a calm warmth, and I knew this moment would be one we'd both remember. As we stood there, breathing in sync, the energy between us softened. Karen rested her head back, a calm look crossing her face as she relaxed, feeling the peace of the moment. Our hands found each other, and I gave hers a gentle squeeze, letting her know I was there. We remained close, both feeling the steady comfort of each other's presence. After a while, Karen looked up with a small smile and whispered, "This moment just us here feels like everything." I wrapped my arms around her and we stood together, letting the calm surround us. It was a shared understanding, a peaceful connection, as we enjoyed the silence and the bond between us. Karen and I shared a deeply memorable evening, connecting in a way that felt natural and close. We held on to each other, finding joy in every laugh and quiet moment. When we finally took a break, Karen glanced around the room, laughing softly. "You know," she teased, "there's actually a bed here." I chuckled, realizing how caught up we'd been, and guided her over, where we both sank into the comfort of the room's soft lighting and relaxed atmosphere. She kicked off her heels and we settled in, enjoying the simplicity of being together, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of quiet connection that words can't always capture. The night felt endless, filled with shared warmth and genuine happiness, as we left all distractions behind. As the weekend continued, Karen checked out of her hotel and spent the rest of the time with me at my apartment. We thought we'd go out Saturday night, but we ended up enjoying each other's company indoors, cooking meals together, and simply unwinding. The whole weekend was lighthearted and joyful, with no plans needed, just laughter, shared moments, and the comfort of being at ease together. Every room in the apartment became part of the memories we built. We shared breakfast in the kitchen, chatted about anything and everything in the living room, and relaxed in the warmth of the bathroom, where the steady supply of hot water allowed us to unwind completely. We felt free, at home, and truly connected, finding joy in the simplest things, creating memories that would stay with us long after the weekend ended. She loved to ride on top for an hour at a time, teasing me just before I would reach my peak. She would let me catch my breath for a moment, then start moving again. When I finally reached my limit, it was more than I had ever experienced before. She also enjoyed spending time at the dining room table, where I would shower her with attention until she found joy several times. When I joined her, she would softly make small sounds and hold on to me tightly, and together we would reach new heights of happiness. By Sunday evening, we were both tired and a little sore. On Monday morning, I took her to the airport and put her on a flight to Sacramento. We decided not to call each other until Saturday, but when that day came, we both got busy signals because we were calling at the same time. After that, we met whenever we could. Each time was wonderful, and we enjoyed moments together. For a while, we traveled a lot, but my move to Denver made the trips easier. We saw each other every couple of weeks for a year and a half and took 2 vacations together, one in Vail and one in the Bahamas. I finished the flying lessons I had started years before and earned my certificate. I bought a small airplane that cost more to maintain and operate than airline tickets, but it allowed me to fly when I wanted. The memory of taking Karen flying over the mountains made me smile for weeks. Melissa's diary. I was happy for Ron. After seeing him so unhappy for so long, it was nice that he found someone who made him happy. They looked good together during the few times Cal and I saw them out, especially when dancing at Fisher's. Ron must have taken some dance lessons because he moved so well. He and Karen seemed to glide across the dance floor, completely focused on each other. It was clear they were in love, which made me feel a bit mixed inside. I had been Sherry's best friend since high school, while Ron was a newer friend. But he looked so happy, and I couldn't blame him at all. Karen was beautiful, and Ron was more handsome than he realized. I knew several women at the club would leave their dates, and some even their husbands, if Ron had shown interest. But he would never do that. I knew my Ronnie. It's clear that they really seemed to belong together. Now that he has moved to Denver, Ron emails me about once a week. His messages are always cheerful, asking about the new baby and how things are going. I never told Ron that I was pretty sure Cal got me pregnant the night when both Karen and I took off our underwear in Fisher's restroom. But I think he suspects it. I did mention the restroom incident to him, so that might be enough for him. Ron is smart and can read between the lines. When Calvin Jr. was born 6 months after Ron left, I wonder if he realized that the R in Cal's middle name stood for Ronald. That's just how he is. Our friend would probably never think that Cal and I named our baby after him to honor their friendship. After her divorce, Sherry had a tough time for a long while. She had to leave her job because news spread around the office about her and Ron's divorce. Every single man, and many who weren't, thought they could make her happy again. Even though she cut them off and embarrassed several of them, they kept trying. Her new job paid less, which made it hard for her to keep up with bills. Eventually, she found a nice 2-bedroom apartment she liked, but it was more than she could really afford, and she had to buy a lot of new clothes. When the sale of the house she shared with Ron finally closed, things improved a bit, but soon she found herself buying food and clothes for 2 new people in her life. I prefer not to get into that. I didn't understand her choices for a long time, and I still don't agree with them. Those 2 roommates, as she called them, would not change my feelings about her situation. It took almost a year after their divorce for me to feel comfortable with Sherry again. She called me every week during that time and always apologized to me and Cal for the mess in Vegas. She was sorry, but sometimes sorry just isn't enough. After a while, I realized she was completely overwhelmed and very ashamed of what she did with that man in Vegas. She felt terrible for hurting her husband. Talking to me was hard for her. She would break down and cry when she tried to express how bad she felt for betraying his trust and love. She said she felt guilty at the time, but got swept up in a feeling of surprising thrill. It reminded her of the fluttery feeling she had in her stomach when sneaking out of her parents' house to meet her first serious boyfriend. She said spending time with a guy from Vegas made her feel young and lively again, as if she had a spark inside. I didn't really get it, and the idea of feeling young again didn't sit well with me. I turned 30 a while back, and Sherry was still just 29. I wasn't sure if I believed a word she said about wanting to feel young again. Hey, guess what? I didn't know this until Sherry and I started meeting again on Saturday mornings for coffee and some gossip. It took a long time for us to get back to that. I had been quite upset with her for a while. One morning she told me she had actually been at Fisher's one night by herself and saw Ron there with Karen. She said it was just before he moved to Denver. She had gone out for a nice dinner that she didn't have to make, but instead ended up watching them dance while trying to eat a cold steak. Sherry said that in that moment she really understood how much she had hurt Ron. She hadn't realized deep down what he had gone through and felt. Seeing him with that woman, as she called her, opened her eyes. It was painful for her to realize that Ron cared for Karen. She said it felt as if someone had pierced her heart. I told her that Ron had every right to be with Karen. I might have sounded a bit short-tempered saying it, but I meant it. She acknowledged that Ron had the right, and she knew it back then, too. They had been divorced for over a month, but the pain still stung her deeply. She was sharing all of this to let me know she finally understood how poorly she had treated the man she loved. I told her it was about time, and surprisingly, Sherry didn't get upset with me. Instead, she seemed genuinely upset, angry with herself. She wanted to find a way to make up for it, but felt trapped by her responsibilities. Sherry and I worked through that tough time and grew closer. I suggested she talk to a counselor or a minister. When she got back on her feet financially, she did see someone who specialized in marriage counseling, and that helped her. Although she never felt completely at peace with what happened, she learned to accept her past without letting it take over her life. If she hadn't found a way to cope, I'm not sure how she would have managed. Now, Sherry comes over all the time, and we chat about anything and everything, just like we used to. My boys adore their Aunt Sherry and race to greet her whenever she arrives. She hugs them tight and plays with them, making them laugh and laugh. Cal took a bit longer to feel comfortable with her again. For a while, he would quietly find another room whenever she was around. I shared stories about my conversations with Sherry, and as Cal saw things for himself, he started to open up. Sherry sometimes brought her two friends over, and Cal really liked them right away. After a while, the house felt a bit lonely when they weren't around. I have a plan to change that. Cal and I are going out to dinner at Fisher's tonight, and I'm excited to see what happens. I want to fill our home with friends and family, even if it means changing diapers. This time, I hope we have a girl. The first 3 years in Denver were busy and full of energy. I was working hard and spending long hours in the office. It was the usual situation. When the bosses saw I could handle responsibility, they gave me more work just to test how much I could take. They hadn't reached my limit. Yet. But they were getting close. Karen and I were still going strong, and I was thinking about asking her to marry me. She never brought it up, though, and sometimes I wondered why. Then things changed in Afghanistan. Our company had taken on some projects to help rebuild the country's infrastructure. One of these projects involved working with a major Defense Department contractor. We were in charge of a contract to build a significant highway north from Kabul to the border with Tajikistan. This road would mainly be used by the military for a long time, but the new Afghan government hoped it would eventually help trade between the two regions. It was a risky situation because remnants of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were not far away in the mountains. They would occasionally cross the border, trying to cause trouble before running back to safety. These incidents were rare, and in recent years, fewer people were willing to take such risks. However, one group managed to get into the country and blew up an important bridge, cutting off the road between our team and the supply stations. At the same time, they had traveled through many small towns and villages within 50 miles of the bridge, damaging things like schools meant to teach both girls and boys, community centers, a few new radio stations, and one TV relay site. The workers on the ground called for more help, and our company had to hire another small business so we could finish our main project on time. It was important for our company's future. 72 hours later, young Mr. Ron Masters was flying to Kabul to oversee the joint effort of two different teams working on the same project. Both companies agreed to this and were glad they didn't have to sort out who would do what. Before I left, I needed to talk to Karen. I would be gone for a while, and we had some things to work out. I needed to know if we were a couple and what that meant for us. "Honey, have you ever thought about getting married?" I asked. I was watching her make a salad in her kitchen the day before I had to go. The knife she was using hit the side of the sink and made a loud noise. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide, and I worried she might hurt herself. I quickly walked over, took her wrist gently, and checked her hand. Thankfully, there was no sign of injury. "I'm sorry," I said. "I thought you might have cut yourself." "I almost did," she replied. Some color returned to her face, and I sat back down at the breakfast bar. "Well, have you thought about it?" I asked. She leaned against the counter, looking at me curiously. "Have you?" she replied, though it wasn't really an answer. I nodded. "Yes, I have," I admitted. "But I'm not sure how you feel about it. Sometimes I think you like having your independence and all." "What else?" she pressed. "I wonder if how we live now works for you. We see each other for a few days each month and have a great time. But you live in Sacramento and I live in Denver. Maybe it's one of those absence makes the heart grow fonder situations. Getting married is a big step, and I wonder if you want me around all the time." I had thought a lot about this. I think I surprised Karen. We had gotten comfortable with each other and hadn't disagreed in a while. "No," she said. "It's not that at all, hun." After a moment, she came to me and wrapped her arms around my neck. She kissed me deeply. "Ronnie," she said slowly when we finally pulled away. "The reason I haven't mentioned this before is different from what you might think." She took a deep breath, still holding on to me, her arms slightly less tight around my neck. "I love you, Ron. That's not a secret, and I know you love me too," she said softly. "The problem is that you keep part of yourself away from me, and I don't think you even realize you're doing it. If that wasn't the case, I would leave my job in a heartbeat and come live with you forever." I was taken aback. What part of me was I keeping from her? We talked for hours. I never figured out what she thought I was holding back. She believed it had to do with me not fully moving on from Sherry, that I still had feelings for her and hadn't put the past behind me. I thought that, if anything, I mostly felt anger toward Sherry. That seemed more like what I was feeling. I became a bit impatient with Karen. I didn't believe there were any good feelings left for my ex-wife, and I told Karen so, but she was sure about her thoughts and wouldn't change her mind. We decided to end the conversation after dinner, agreeing not to let it turn into a big argument. We had only 24 hours before I was set to leave for Afghanistan, and life was too short for disputes. Later that night, we shared an intimate moment and then fell into each other's arms, tired but happy. "Ronnie," she said just before we both drifted off to sleep, "let's think about our future while you're away, okay? When you come back, we can go somewhere together for a long time and figure things out, all right?" "Okay, it's a date," I replied softly. She didn't say more. After a while, she turned away from me and we settled into a comfortable position. My arms wrapped around her and we fell asleep peacefully, waking up early again to share a loving moment before I had to leave. When I returned to Denver, I had about 6 hours until my flight to JFK Airport in New York. From there, I'd take several flights heading east to Europe and then to Asia, working my way to Kabul. There weren't many airlines that flew into that troubled country, and my company had a policy for employees to use American Airlines whenever possible. This made my travel plan more complicated than it might have been. After washing a load of clothes and packing what I thought I would need in Afghanistan, I still had 2 hours left with not much to do before heading to the airport. Thinking about my near argument with Karen, I searched through the back of my closet until I found the box with all the papers from my divorce. At the bottom of a pile of papers, I found the envelope of photos I had taken of my wife and another man. Next to it was a small ring box. This box held Sherry's engagement and wedding rings. She had sent them back to me through her lawyer the day after our divorce was final. I had thought the rings belonged to her since I had given them to her, but returning them was her way of closing that chapter of our marriage. I looked at the photos one by one. They made me uncomfortable, but I no longer felt deep anger or hurt. It was as if the images showed two strangers instead of one loved one and a stranger. In a way, they seemed like low-quality images that did not mean much to me. I realized I didn't want to leave these behind in case something happened to me in Afghanistan. I quickly pushed the papers back into the box, leaving the photos out. Then I fed the photos into my shredder. Moments later, they became unrecognizable bits of shiny paper. I didn't think about them anymore. Afghanistan in late winter is harsh. It is always very cold, often snowy, and usually windy. Often all three types of weather happen at once. It is rare to have a nice day. Also, the northern part of the country looks very barren and dull to me. I couldn't understand why anyone would want to live here. Afghanistan has been inhabited for a long time, and I could only shake my head in disbelief. The days are long and the work is hard and risky, even without the threat of attacks from Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Operating heavy equipment is dangerous by itself, but we had a solid safety program and followed the guidelines closely. For protection from potential threats, we had a group of Marines led by a young lieutenant. However, they could not be everywhere, and I often felt vulnerable, worried about my team's safety. After a month, I persuaded the senior sergeant in the Marine unit to lend me an M4, a smaller version of the M16. Its usual owner was on emergency leave and had yet to return. Technically, I was just watching over it for him. Having the M4 made me feel more secure. I was a decent shot with it and had always been good with firearms. Back home, I could hit a deer at over 200 yards with my Remington Model 700 without any trouble. The M4 felt right in my hands. By the third month of my stay, we had nearly rebuilt the bridge. New foundations were poured where needed, and we replaced the parts that had been destroyed. At the same time, we created a plan to bring supplies to the crew working on the road to the north. We used helicopters to deliver urgent materials. For other equipment and vehicles, we built a dirt road around the gorge and through open land. It worked, but it took a long time. The crew at the end of the road had to ask for supplies well in advance. Actually, things were getting better every day. Our contract was secure, and the road would be finished on time, or maybe even earlier. The Department of the Army even gave us another small contract that looked promising. We were working hard, but with not much else to do in that empty area, we often worked 14 hours a day or more just to keep busy. Melissa's diary. When I heard that Ron was going to Afghanistan, I was really worried. Ron was as close to me as a brother, and I cared a lot about him. When I told Sherry, she looked pale and almost fainted. It surprised me because she and Ron had been divorced for almost 3 years and had been apart even longer. It has been quite a while since I had a chance to write in this diary. If I repeat anything, I'll just have to delete it when I read this later, I guess. Let's see, where was I? Oh, some time ago I had to help Sherry feel better about herself again. For a long time, she was really hard on herself for causing so much sadness, and it was affecting her health. She got counseling again, and it finally started helping her. She got through the worst of her sadness by working with her counselor on what happened and how to make things better. She has been doing pretty well since then. When I told her about Ron's trip, though, she got really upset. It wasn't until we started getting regular emails from him that she began to calm down. The emails didn't come too often because the communication wasn't great over there, but they were enough to ease our worries. He mentioned that it was hard work and kind of dull at times. He said he didn't have much to do except work. On the bright side, he had lost some extra weight he had been concerned about and was in great shape. He even shared a photo in one of his emails that showed he was right. Sherry made me print a large copy and keep a few smaller ones, too. Around that time, I noticed that Sherry wasn't dating anyone. When I asked about it, I felt silly. She hadn't been on any dates since her and Ron separated, and I had been completely unaware. Isn't that just awful? My best friend and I were a bit clueless. Anyway, Cal and I started inviting Sherry to join us for dinner and outings, sometimes even to Fisher's for dancing. She enjoyed the fast dances with some guys, but she was very selective. Many men faced rejection, and a few left feeling embarrassed after she turned them down. Cal mentioned that Sherry had a strong way with words when she wanted to speak up. I guess that showed me how she could express herself. I noticed she only danced slow dances with Cal and a few trustworthy older married men. Also, she would only have a little white wine when we went out, usually just a couple of glasses for the whole night. It didn't take a lot of thought to see that she was waiting for something special. One day, I managed to get her talking about it while we relaxed in the backyard under the pecan tree, enjoying good food and chatting about random things. Eventually, she opened up a bit and shared her belief that Ron would come back to town one day. When he did return, she hoped he would see that she hadn't been with anyone else, and maybe he'd forgive her for things that happened in the past. She said she would wait for him, no matter how long it took, hoping he would notice how much she had changed. Sherry wasn't overly confident they would get back together, but she held on to a small hope. It felt like she was serving some kind of penance until Ron came back and acknowledged her growth. She didn't know when he would return, just that she believed he would. I suggested a few ways to encourage him to come home, but she wasn't interested. She firmly believed in not using any tricks. I told her it sounded like she was setting herself up for a long and lonely wait, but she simply smiled, confident that he would come back. I decided to drop the subject after that. I even tried to introduce her to some nice guys from Cal's work, but she declined every time. I wasn't happy about the situation, but Sherry seemed fine with it. She didn't want to date anyone at all, and I had to accept that, even if it bothered me. After going through some counseling sessions, Sherry started to feel better. She had lost a lot of weight due to stress and guilt, but now she had gained most of it back and looked great. I couldn't help but feel a bit jealous. Even after having 3 kids, I didn't look quite as good as she did. It's not fair. The woman seems to be happier and more focused than ever since her divorce. She volunteers with the local PTA and works hard on the neighborhood watch program. Her life looks fun again. Her 2 roommates probably help lift her spirits. They always seem to smile, which must give her a good boost. Sherry is also doing well at work. After her divorce, she took a job at a new accounting firm and has been promoted 3 times in just under 3 years. She now manages 16 auditors and financial analysts, and it looks like she could get an even better job when the person above her finally retires. She really enjoys her work. She's been coming over for barbecues with Cal and me for a long time, and she is great with the kids. She feels like part of our extended family. Our oldest boy is 5 now. His birthday was last week. My 3-year-old, Cal Jr., thinks of her like a second mom, and my 14-month-old daughter follows Sherry around wherever she goes. It's adorable to see my little girl take a few steps toward Sherry, wobble a bit, and then sit down. After that, she crawls really fast to catch up to Sherry and giggles when she does. All 3 of my kids really adore her. Ron should be emailing us again soon. It's been about a week, and he usually sends us something every week or 10 days. I always share his emails with Sherry. She asks for the latest one if I haven't sent it to her right away. I wonder what Ron would think if he knew. I also learned that spring in Afghanistan isn't the best place either. Instead of snow, we had dust blowing everywhere, and I wasn't sure which was worse. Both have their problems. I'm starting to prefer snow, at least it melts away. Dust and sand just get everywhere and cause issues. About a quarter of our heavy machinery, bulldozers, dump trucks, rock crushers, was out of order on any given day because dirt blocked air intakes or messed up oil. It was frustrating, especially since most of our machines are built to handle these conditions. I started to think something might be going wrong on purpose. 2 weeks after my first concerns, Marine Lance Corporal Arvin Cantwell and I caught one of the workers tampering with an air filter that should never have been touched. We didn't like hiring these workers because it was hard to check their backgrounds, and we had no way of knowing if they were sent by a local leader or if they just wandered in. We might have caught someone connected to Osama bin Laden. The dirt and rocks we found in the air intake showed he had links to a terrorist group, so we handed him over to a group of Afghani National Guard soldiers. They took him away, and we never saw him again. This made us more cautious, and our equipment time improved a lot, but other problems kept appearing. We had about 40 days left in our schedule, so we tightened security around all our vehicles. We first parked them far from the main area where locals and contractors gathered. Then Lieutenant Frederick set up a night watch around them, and my team helped with that. My crew didn't have weapons, but they could make a lot of noise if they noticed something unusual. The goal was to raise an alarm quickly so the Marines in our security team could handle any issues. Everyone felt worried that if something were to happen, it would happen soon. Once the road was cleared to the border, fixing any issues would be easier and quicker. We all felt uneasy. I guess I need to talk to Melissa. It turns out she has been sharing my emails with my ex-wife, Sherry. The last time I talked with Karen, she mentioned Sherry as a problem in our relationship. Karen believed I wasn't fully over Sherry and that she would always be a shadow between us. I thought that idea was silly, but I kept that thought to myself. I may not understand women well, but I knew better than to say it out loud. Anyway, it annoyed me that Melissa was giving Sherry updates about me. Melissa made it worse by saying Sherry was worried about me. It really got under my skin. In a way, it felt like Karen was right. It seemed like Sherry was still part of my life, even though we had been divorced for over 3 years. I didn't like that Melissa told me Sherry wasn't dating anyone and wouldn't date because of her guilt from how she treated me in the past. So what? Last night, some good memories came back to me, like the first time I went into the little cafe off campus. I was working toward a mechanical engineering degree, going to classes during the day and working at night. Sherry was a waitress there, and she greeted me with a big smile when I sat at her table. I think I fell for her before she even gave me a menu. There were other dreams, but that one stood out the most. A week later, I was being careful when I noticed a chubby young Afghan man in the lunch line. He appeared suddenly between two large trucks, catching me off guard since I hadn't seen anyone there. The longer I watched him, the more uneasy I felt. He seemed to come out of nowhere like he had been hiding, and he was looking around nervously, like someone new to a big city. I set my cup down on one of the marine trucks and adjusted my rifle strap on my shoulder, getting it ready just in case. I wanted to be prepared for anything. Lance Corporal Myers was with me by the truck. His tray and coffee cup were next to mine. Most of us preferred to stand while eating so we could see everything around us and respond quickly to anything unusual. The truck fender was a good height for this. Billy, as we called him, was one of the squad leaders, and over the months we had become good friends. We were known for being the best shots in our informal target practice. Each morning I prepared my rifle just like the Marines did. I had already pulled back the bolt when loading, and now I closed it to ready the weapon. Watching the young man, I made sure the safety was off, but kept my finger away from the trigger. I wanted to avoid any accidents. You should never be on the trigger unless you are ready to shoot. "Sir, Mr. Masters, what's wrong?" Billy asked when he heard the rifle mechanism click and saw I was ready for anything. "I'm not sure," I replied, still watching the young man. He had a strange look on his face, focused yet scared. Suddenly my worries grew stronger. This young man was unusually round for this area, where food was scarce. Typically only older, well-off men had extra weight, showing their wealth. This young man didn't fit that description. "Wow," I whispered as I noticed him reaching under his loose clothes, pulling something out. I couldn't find anything in the Afghan clothing that matched what he was holding. He hurried toward a large group of Marines and my co-workers who were gathered around big soup pots waiting for more food. I opened my hand and let my cup of coffee fall. "No!" I shouted. The man turned to look at me. A strong breeze stuck his clothes to his body, and I could see something heavy wrapped around his upper body and waist like a vest. He turned to run toward the group of men. Quickly raising my weapon, I aimed at him. There were many people nearby, so normally I wouldn't have fired, but this was not a normal situation. I saw the sudden impact, and he fell forward. In that brief moment, I realized that a shot like that could take someone down instantly. Thankfully, the threat was neutralized, and the group of construction workers remained safe. "Get ready! Get ready!" Corporal Myers shouted into his radio. He was using an alert signal from an old movie that had become a quick warning cry for our platoon. The lieutenant didn't like it, but he decided to go along with it. Suddenly, there were more sounds of gunfire coming from behind us. Billy and I turned to see a line of armed men rushing toward our camp. Others were moving fast from a ravine that we hadn't noticed before. The Lance Corporal and I dropped to one knee and began to fire back. I kept my weapon on the semi-automatic setting and kept firing. More Marines were joining in now. I heard the lieutenant directing another group to position themselves and provide support fire on the attackers. Within moments, they began to shoot, and the number of attackers started to go down quickly. I released the empty magazine and put a new one in, making sure it was secure. Then I noticed an older Afghan man wearing a black turban running toward me, his face filled with anger. He was shouting loudly and was armed with a pistol. Billy was busy with the other attackers and couldn't help, so I had to act quickly. I turned awkwardly to face him and started firing back. This time I switched the weapon to automatic mode with my thumb and began firing short bursts. The second burst caused 3 holes from his waist to his throat, and he lost interest in harming Billy and me. He kept running forward until he fell face first into the ground. It took him a bit to stop moving due to his injuries, but he was done for once he hit the ground. Most of this was explained to me later because while I was firing, the last shot he took hit me in the left shoulder. The bullet struck me just as I was getting to my feet and trying to move toward the safety of the Humvee. I stepped into a hole and twisted my ankle, causing me to start to fall. The impact from the bullet made my fall worse, and my head hit the heavy fender of the Humvee. I was told I lost consciousness right away. Melissa's diary. Ronnie's hurt. They say he's been shot, but I can't find out how serious it is. I feel like screaming if they don't give me more information. What I didn't know was that Ron listed me, Cal, and that Karen person as next of kin in case something happened to him. With no close family left, Ron probably thought it made sense. When he gets home, I'll hug him for thinking of us. But I will also tell him how worried I am about him being in dangerous places. Sherry took the news surprisingly well. I couldn't believe how calm she was this time. She had been very upset when she learned he was going to that country. Now she was reassuring me, saying he was going to be okay. She insisted he would come home someday, that it was just a matter of time. I really hope she's right. He hasn't met my 2 young children yet. They were born after he left for Denver, and I want them to know him. Oh God, I hope he is all right. I woke up in an army hospital on the outskirts of Kabul. My head hurt more than anything I had ever felt. When I tried to move, sharp pain shot through my shoulder. My vision narrowed to a dark tunnel before clearing up. Holding still, I carefully lifted my head a little off the pillow to look around. My right arm had a needle in it, connected to a bag of blood hanging on a pole next to my bed. There were a couple of other bottles up there too, but I didn't know what they were for. I craned my neck painfully to see that my shoulder was covered with bandages. I gently moved my fingers and realized something beneath my clothing was causing me a lot of pain. A middle-aged woman in a green hospital outfit entered the room from a doorway I hadn't seen before. She glanced at me quickly, then stepped back to call for help. Soon, a man and another woman arrived, and they all gathered next to the bed I was starting to understand I was in. "How are you feeling?" the man asked in a deep voice. I noticed the silver badges on his light green shirt under the white coat, so I figured he was a doctor. "My shoulder hurts," I managed to say. It was tough to get the words out, and I had to swallow hard a few times. I rubbed my throat and pretended to drink. The doctor nodded and gestured for the first woman to fill a glass with water from a steel pitcher. She helped me drink using a straw. "Thank you," I said, my voice still weak but better than before. "Where am I?" I asked, looking at each of the 3 medical staff. "Kabul," the doctor replied plainly. He pointed a small flashlight into each of my eyes quickly. After a moment, he put it away with a grunt. "What's your name?" he asked out of the blue. "Ronald Terrence Masters," I replied. "And yours?" I felt a bit annoyed. "Dr. Evans," he answered briefly, but a small smile crept onto his face. "Do you remember what happened?" he asked in a friendlier tone. I nodded slowly, being careful with my shoulder. "We were attacked by some Taliban fighters," I explained slowly. "A suicide bomber came in, and then others came at us from behind, along with an older man with a gun." I paused, but didn't recall anything else. "I can't remember after that," I said, feeling frustrated. The doctor nodded, looking thoughtful. "From what I've been told," he began casually, "you hit something hard and fainted. But it looks like you'll be okay. Your skull seems intact, and you likely just have a mild concussion. Your memory seems fine, and your pupils look normal, so your head injury isn't your biggest concern." I accepted what he said. I still felt much the same as before the fight, except for the headache. Thankfully, it was easing a little bit. "And I think your shoulder injury won't be serious either," he said confidently. It was easy for him to say that since he wasn't the one in pain. "Ugh," I murmured when I attempted to move. The younger woman, who seemed to be a nurse, gently wiped the sweat off my forehead. "We can help with your pain," the doctor said as he wrote on some papers attached to a clipboard at the end of my bed. After that, he left with the older woman, speaking quickly about things I didn't understand. The young nurse, a first lieutenant, stayed to cool my face with water. When I asked, she let me adjust the bed so I could sit up. I had never liked lying flat since I was a kid, and sitting up felt much better. When the older woman returned, she attached a needle to a machine connected to my arm, and soon the pain faded quickly. I drifted back to sleep. 2 weeks later, I was able to move around, which is what the Army medical staff called ambulatory, and feeling a bit restless. My shoulder was healing well, and they had me doing gentle movements to keep the muscles flexible. I found a computer that I could use and logged into my email. I sent messages to Karen and Melissa to let them know I was okay. My inbox was filled with messages from both women and, surprisingly, from many people back at work. I wrote to my boss and secretary in Denver, asking them to let everyone know I was fine and improving. I mentioned that I could only use my right arm right now, so typing was slow. I would respond to all the emails when I could, but it would take some time. Yesterday, the Marines came to visit. They had returned to a base camp for some rest before heading out on another mission. I didn't know what to expect when the nurse wheeled me, even though I really didn't need the wheelchair, into the hospital day room. A few minutes later, the outside doors swung open and the entire Marine platoon marched in. They lined up in front of me, forming a group around 3 sides of the room. The lieutenant leading them stepped forward and saluted. I later found out that the 2 officers next to him were his company and battalion commanders. The nurse helped me stand up. I felt a bit awkward in my old hospital pajamas and robe, but nobody seemed to mind. The lieutenant called everyone to stand at attention and shouted a command for them to salute me, even though I knew it wasn't usual for military personnel to salute civilians. They did it anyway. After instructing his team to stand in formation, the lieutenant read an informal award citation from a piece of paper that looked old. Then they handed me a large, round piece of metal from the bottom of an artillery shell, polished to a warm brown tone. According to the citation, it was meant to represent a bronze star for bravery in an event that happened at kilometer 137. The citation mentioned my quick reaction had saved many Marines and civilian workers. I felt my face turn red, and I was so overwhelmed that I could barely speak. Eventually, I managed to thank the officers and my fellow Marines with a shaky voice. I asked if I could shake hands with everyone in the group and moved to the door. As they walked out, I shook each person's hand and then joined them outside to say goodbye. The next morning, I took a military medical evacuation flight to Landstuhl, Germany, where I stayed for a few days. Then, I flew back home. I knew the company was covering all the medical expenses, but I felt that the staff had gone above and beyond in their care. Everywhere I went, Marines approached me to chat, always mentioning my Bronze Star. I was surprised strangers recognized my face and name, along with details of my experiences in the field. It amazed me how quickly news traveled among military personnel. I admired the bond among those brave men in the Marine Corps and pondered if I had missed my calling, but it was too late for me to make a change now. It was time to return to what I knew best. My vacation in Afghanistan, while thrilling, had come to an end. My office in the Denver corporate complex was waiting for me when I returned. Aside from a slight mustiness, it looked just as it had 6 months ago. Unfortunately, my relationship with Karen didn't survive the long separation. She wasn't seeing anyone else. She was quite lonely. She waited until I was back and starting to heal to share the sad news. We had a disagreement, but I could see she was firm in her belief that Sherry's memory was still affecting us. I sensed something must have pushed her to this point, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. I held back my anger to avoid saying things that would make our separation even harder. I didn't agree with her views, but I had to accept that this was how she felt. While I didn't like it, I knew deep down she was right about the breakup, even if her reasons were not the ones I felt were true. We had been together for a long time, and while I thought about asking her to marry me, I never did. We parted as friends, or as close to friends as 2 former lovers could be. It hit me fast how quickly I moved on. Just 2 weeks after Karen and I broke up, I started dating a woman from the 3rd floor of our building. It was enjoyable, but not serious, just something fun to pass the time. 2 months later, I overheard 2 men chatting. One was the executive assistant to the chief financial officer, and the other worked in human resources. They were discussing my name being put forward for a new job. The CEO was getting ready to announce the change. They shouldn't have been talking about it, but even in private spaces, people don't always check to see if anyone is listening. A week later, I got the official news. I was going back to where I started, but this time as executive vice president. I was curious about this opportunity. It felt like a promotion, with a lot of potential for growth. The job I had was a bit of a dead end, and it would have taken years for the people above me to retire and open up a space. After thinking it over for a couple of days, I accepted the new position. 4 years and a couple of weeks after my divorce, I was going home. "Hey, is anyone home?" I knocked on Melissa and Cal's front door hard enough to make a sound. I was smiling widely because I hadn't seen my friends in a long time and I was eager to be with them. I heard movement behind the closed door before it swung open. Ron! At first, I wasn't sure if Melissa was happy to see me. She stood there for a moment, looking surprised, before throwing open the screen door and jumping into my arms. She wrapped her arms around my neck and started crying. I gently patted her back, saying it was okay and other comforting things. The best way to help Melissa when she got emotional was to wait until she calmed down. After a moment, she was all better. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" she asked, playfully hitting me in the chest. I pretended to stumble back, which made her smile. She took my arm and pulled me into the cool house. "Cal!" she yelled. "Come here! It's Ron!" I was sure Cal could hear her from far away. He soon appeared in the living room, running towards us. We laughed and patted each other's shoulders until he suddenly realized what he was doing. I told him my injury was all better now. Just then, a group of young children burst into the living room, eager to find out what the noise was about. There were 5 of them, 2 boys and 3 girls. The oldest boy looked just like his father, Cal. He was now 6 years old. He had only been 2 when I left. His younger brother, I learned, was 3.5. I shook hands with them as if they were grown-ups, and they seemed to love it. The smallest girl was Melissa's youngest, named Jeanette. Melissa tried to get Jeanette's thumb out of her mouth, but the little girl wasn't letting go. The other 2 girls were identical twins, with lovely blonde hair and charming smiles. Melissa called them over, and I knelt down to be at their height. "Girls, this is Ron. He's Jeanette, Ben, and Cal Jr.'s Uncle Ron. Ron, this is Cassandra and Courtney. We're watching them while their mom is at work." Her voice wavered a bit, but I let it slide. Melissa is always full of feelings, even when things seem calm. I shook hands with each little girl seriously. "My goodness, you 2 are just as cute as can be," I said as I gently touched the head of the one on my left. "Cassandra, right?" She nodded with a big movement. "Do you like being called Cassandra, or do you prefer Cassie?" "Cassie," she replied in her small voice. I smiled back at her. "Then Cassie it is," I said warmly. I turned to the girl on my right. "And that must mean you are Courtney, huh?" She nodded eagerly. I settled back on my heels. "Courtney and Cassie, what pretty names for 2 lovely girls," I told them. They smiled shyly. "Are you our Uncle Ron, too?" Cassie asked softly. I looked up at Melissa and Cal, noticing a sudden change in how they stood that puzzled me. "Do you think their mom will mind if they call me that while I'm here?" I asked. They exchanged glances. "I guess that would be okay," Melissa said carefully. "We should check with their mom, but it should be fine for now." She seemed a bit anxious. I made a mental note to ask her why later. I turned back to the cheerful twins. "Then Uncle Ron it is for now, okay?" They grinned widely. I smiled back, watching them for a moment. There was something familiar about them, but I couldn't quite place it. "And I know I'm Uncle Ron to this little one," I said, spotting 16-month-old Jeanette, who had been inching closer while I talked to the older girls. I reached out, scooped her up, and pulled her close. Just as she moved past her surprised look, she erupted in giggles as I playfully tickled her. Suddenly, I wrapped my arm around Cassie and pulled her in for some light-hearted tickling. Courtney jumped in to join us. I just had to tickle her belly and sides, too. Not long after, the 2 boys jumped into the fun, wanting attention as well. The living room turned into a playful chaos. Everyone was trying to tickle everyone else, but I had the upper hand. I wasn't ticklish, so no amount of little fingers poking at me could make me laugh. After a while, the twins ran off, pretending to be scared, and Jeanette followed after them. The boys grew tired of the game at the same time, plopping down on the floor against the couch to catch their breath. I noticed the girls peeking back from the doorway, but chose to ignore them. "That was fun," I said, catching my breath. I couldn't help but smile. Both parents looked at me in surprise. They expected me to act more serious, asking the usual adult-child questions, giving them a kiss, and then sending them away. I chuckled at my 2 best friends. When I stood up, Melissa wrapped her arms around me tightly again. "You had us so worried," she said softly, her tone serious for the first time in a while. "I was really scared you wouldn't come back to us." I could see tears forming in her eyes again. "Melissa," I said firmly, "I'm home, I'm fine, and I won't be going anywhere like that again, okay?" That helped a little, but my shirt pocket was still getting wet. "It was so hard when we heard you were hurt." "You're like a brother to me, and I was really scared," she said. I held her at arm's length for a moment, feeling a lump in my throat. "Well, I don't have a sister or brother either," I replied. I turned to Cal. "Cal?" He nodded in response. "Can I adopt your wife as my sister?" I asked, my tone a mix of serious and playful. "Sure, why not?" Cal said with a sigh. "But if she starts crying again, you're on your own. You get that, right?" Melissa stuck out her tongue at him. "So, what do you think, Lissa?" I asked. "Shall we make it official? Brother and sister forever?" She nodded slowly, sensing I was up to something, but not quite knowing what. I stood in front of her, taking both her hands in mine. "I, Ronald Terrence Masters, take you, Melissa, to love and respect, to tease and annoy." I dashed for the kitchen door and out into the backyard, but she managed to swat at me before I could get away. The 5 kids watched in confusion, unsure of what the adults were chatting about. Ben, Melissa, and Cal's oldest, looked from me to his mother, then to his sister and the twins, trying to understand. He wondered why any decent guy would want a sister he didn't really need to have. That evening, I enjoyed a delicious home-cooked meal, something I didn't realize I had missed. Melissa lit up with joy as I genuinely praised her cooking. When I kissed her cheek goodnight, I called her sis in a serious voice, and she called me brother. I knew that once she closed the door, she would likely cry again, but despite Cal's belief that it was my responsibility, he would have to handle it, not me. A week later, at a deli in the downtown area, I was reviewing the housing inspector's report for the house I wanted to buy. The roof needed repairs, and the sellers had offered to lower the price by the highest estimate if I agreed to close the deal now, accepting the roof as it was. That worked for me. I liked the house from the moment I saw it and was eager to move in. It would be the first 2-story house I'd ever lived in. I signed the equity paperwork and put my pen away, then organized the documents and placed them in my briefcase. "Hello, stranger," a woman said. Suddenly I felt nervous. I looked up to see a tall, attractive brunette standing beside my table. I slowly got up. "Hello, Sherry," I replied. We shared a long look and I shook off my surprise. "Where are my manners?" I said. "Please, join me." I pulled the chair out for her. She nodded and sat down gracefully. I hadn't remembered her being so poised since our divorce, but memories can be tricky. The last time I saw her wasn't a pleasant memory for either of us. "Thank you," she said, and we both studied each other for a moment. She smiled. "I wasn't sure you wouldn't get angry with me and ask me to leave," she admitted, recalling how our last conversation ended. I felt a slight blush creeping up my neck. "I should apologize for how I spoke to you that day," I said softly, trying to control the embarrassment rising within me. "No matter what happened, I shouldn't have used such harsh words." "That's all right," she replied, searching my face for what I felt. I shook my head. "No, I'm ashamed of how I acted, Sherry. My parents taught me better. Mom would have scolded me for talking like that." "It's in the past now," she said gently. "You did have a lot to deal with back then." She blushed a little, remembering. "Like you said, it's all behind us. It was almost 4.5 years ago? No, a little more, wasn't it?" I asked, and she nodded. "We're almost 5 years older than when we separated," I said carefully. "5 years wiser, do you think?" she asked softly. "I like to think so," I replied, trying to be honest. "Sometimes I don't feel that way, but I do my best." "Me too," she said kindly. We talked quietly for another 30 minutes until she needed to return to work. As we spoke, I noticed every move she made. Each one felt familiar, but also different from how I remembered. Sherry was now 31. She had been just 20 when we first met. I found myself comparing the new Sherry to the one I had known, and I realized I liked many things about her now. She was calm and confident. Her eyes met mine firmly without being harsh. She sat straight, showing her confidence. The grown-up Sherry wasn't a typical beauty, not like a model who was very thin and glamorous, but she was very attractive and always had been. Her bright green eyes were wide-set on a well-shaped nose with small, light freckles. Her lips were full but not overly swollen like some women choose. Her high cheekbones gave her a slight Slavic look, a trait from one of her great-grandfathers, and she had an energy that lit up her face. When she smiled, it was hard not to smile back. She seemed fuller than before. She had often complained about her figure in the past. She'd always said she was a B, and I had jokingly said she was a B+. Now she looked like she might be a C. I wondered how to ask, but there are some questions you just don't ask your ex-wife. "Well," she said, glancing at her watch, "I have to go before my boss gets upset." I was surprised by how disappointed I felt when she said that. I stood up as well. She paused and moistened her lips before speaking again. "Ron, could we meet somewhere to talk sometime? I mean, without a hurry?" I looked at her for a long moment. There was a hint of hope in her voice. "Would you like to go to dinner sometime?" I asked on impulse. "We could talk then." She smiled, and I saw joy in her eyes. "Tomorrow is Friday," she suggested gently. Somewhere casual?" I asked. "How about Golden Corral?" she offered. "That place seemed like a good idea to me, too." She wrote her cell phone number on a napkin and tucked it in my shirt pocket. She mentioned she was never far from her phone. When she bent over to use the table as a desk, her blouse slipped slightly. She was meeting me at the new restaurant on the Loop. She mentioned she wouldn't be there before 8 p.m. I assured her I would wait. As Sherry walked away, I noticed her graceful legs and how she still carried herself beautifully, just like when I first met her. Before she left, she paused and gave me a warm smile. That evening, I spent time reflecting on my life. The next day was similar. I was on a leave from my job and had only visited my new office briefly to let them know I was around. My first day back would be a week from Monday. I found a house quickly and completed all the small tasks needed for moving. With all this time on my hands, I had room to think about many things. Seeing Sherry after all this time had surprised me. I thought I would run into her eventually, but this encounter caught me off guard. I hadn't prepared myself for the feelings she stirred in me. We had been divorced for just over 4 years. It had been so long since I last saw her. I didn't attend the final court hearing, and my lawyer told me she hadn't either. We hadn't had any contact for years, and I was surprised to feel my heart race at the sight of her. I clearly remembered what she had done to me. It was never a question in my mind. I could easily recall vivid moments from that time. I used to keep photos from that night, but I had gotten rid of them before leaving for Afghanistan. I felt a sense of relief when they were gone, just scraps of paper in the shredder. When I tried to reach for the anger I had felt about Sherry's betrayal, I found only memories, not the intense feelings of hurt I once had. I was amazed at how much I had changed. I wondered why the pain had faded, but I couldn't find a good reason. I knew the saying that time heals all wounds, but I felt there needed to be more to it. I didn't know what that could be. I had been at the restaurant for about 20 minutes when Sherry arrived. I had tried to hold off on getting there early, wanting to give myself a little power in the conversation, but I couldn't stay away from the place. When she pulled into the parking lot, she saw me in my SUV. She hurried over and apologized for making me wait, but I had to admit she arrived right on time, and there was no need for an apology. My plan to feel in control during our talks faded away so fast that I barely noticed. We chatted for a long time after the waitress brought our steaks, mine cooked medium rare and hers well done. We talked about my new job, and she smiled warmly, patting my hand on the table as she congratulated me. She wanted to know every detail of my trip to Afghanistan, even the tough moments I faced there. She listened closely, hardly taking her eyes off me, and at times I struggled to keep my focus on my story. I couldn't remember her showing that much interest when we were married. It felt nice and comforting to have her attention. At one point, when I pointed to my left shoulder to show her where I had been hurt, she got up from her seat across the table and moved next to me. She wanted to see the scar, and I couldn't say no. I unbuttoned my shirt just enough for her to see the small mark that remained. She gently touched it with her fingers and looked at me in a way that almost made me want to kiss her. I wasn't sure how she would react, so she returned to her seat before I got too flustered. Melissa's diary. I can't believe it. Sherry somehow ran into my brother just a few days after he arrived. She claims it was just a chance meeting in a cafeteria where he was having lunch, but I'm not sure how she knew where to find him, so for now, I'll take her word for it. I'll never understand how she got him to go out with her the very next night. That girl moves fast. She said they went to Golden Corral, a bright and open place, so neither of them felt rushed. She mentioned they talked for a long time, and Ron listened while she shared everything she had practiced saying for the last 2 years. She told him she was sorry for what she'd done, and how ashamed she felt for allowing that guy to hurt her before, and for staying in touch with him even after she returned. She made it clear to Ron that there was no excuse for her actions. Ron, bless him, didn't rush her or interrupt her story. Sometimes he surprises me by doing the right thing, even when he doesn't mean to. When she finished apologizing for the pain she caused him and for being dishonest, she said Ron smiled and told her it was hard to stay mad at someone who was so honest. He explained that after everything between the time here, the trip to Denver, and that tough time in Afghanistan, the anger and bitterness had faded. He hoped she had moved on from her anger too. Sherry said she told him she felt sorry about the mistakes she had made. Ron thought it was time for her to let those feelings go. He mentioned it was as if everything that happened was to 2 different people. He believed they could start fresh now, but I wondered when she would tell him about her 2 roommates. If they were beginning anew, he should know about that, right? Anyway, she mentioned she was so happy when she got home that she cried for an hour. It felt like a heavy weight had been lifted from her. I tried to tell her to take things slow because he might suddenly remember some of the pain from the past, and everything could change quickly. I don't think she paid much attention, though. The next thing she said was that she loved him more than when they first got married. When she realized this, she cried for another hour, and that was, oh no, now I'm crying too. And Cal has told me before I can't do that over my keyboard or it might break or something. I should stop now. I thought I managed the first meeting with Sherry pretty well, given everything. When she started talking about her actions and how they affected me, I braced myself for old feelings to resurface, but they didn't. I told her that those events were over 4 years ago, and we weren't the same people we were then. I encouraged her to let go of those painful memories. Without realizing it, I mentioned that those things happened in a marriage that no longer existed. I also said that the divorce had closed off a lot of the hurt. The surprise was that halfway through my speech, I truly felt that way. The joy on her face was obvious and uplifting. Sherry and I met to talk several times over the next month, usually at a restaurant like the first time. But sometimes we took a long lunch and went to a park. Each time we discussed moments from our past that had led to our divorce. We found ourselves getting more comfortable talking without anger or blame. I started to worry that our calm discussions might give Sherry a sense of closure that I didn't fully feel. One evening, we spent a couple of hours at Denny's discussing how, even though I had accepted what she had done, I could never forget it. I was ready to forgive her, but I made it clear that this should not be seen as a complete pardon for her past actions. She still had to take care of them. To my surprise, Sherry was ready to accept what I said. She told me she couldn't blame anyone else for her situation and that she would have to live with it for a long time. She opened her purse to show me a photo I had taken the night I caught her with someone else. The picture was old, but still clear. I didn't know what to say. She understood my point before I could fully explain it, and I didn't have to persuade her at all. In some ways, she even went further than I expected. It was a bit unsettling. What was interesting was that neither of us felt bad talking about it. It was like we needed to get it out of the way, and once we did, we could move on. After that, we spent the rest of the evening discussing everything except our difficult past. I got her talking about her job, and she became really excited while telling me about supervising a big group of analysts. She truly loved her work and the people around her. By the time we left Denny's, I felt like I knew so much about her coworkers and their families. I had to leave a $20 tip for our waitress because we had been at her table all night. I think we drank enough coffee to cover it, so it worked out well. "So you're going to turn 4 next month, and so is your sister? That's great," I said to Cassie, who stood next to my right knee while her sister Courtney sat on my lap. Courtney was quiet, snuggling against me with her eyes closed. She was really tired. Both girls wore matching pink shorts, white tops with cartoon characters, and little white sandals. "We're twins, silly," Cassie said with a giggle. "We always have birthdays at the same time." I pretended to be amazed and got her talking about what she wanted for her birthday. Courtney woke up enough to join in the conversation and moved to sit more on my left thigh, making room for her twin. Soon I had both little girls on my lap, chatting away. I was surprised at how grown-up they sounded. Since I didn't use baby talk with them, they didn't use it with me. It was interesting. Melissa and Cal often babysat the girls, so they were usually there when I visited my sister and her family. I hadn't met their parents yet, but I planned to ask if I could buy the girls a present. Maybe Melissa could pass a message along to them for me. Anyway, the girls and I got along really well. They quickly started calling me Uncle Ron, just like Melissa's kids did. The twins played together, trying to catch my attention while also competing with each other. It was sweet, and it made me smile. I remembered how women often talked about a biological clock, and I wondered if I was feeling something similar as a man. I set the twins down and pointed out where the other kids had found something interesting in the yard. I walked over to where Cal was grilling steaks for the adults and hot dogs for the kids. I always enjoyed going to Cal and Melissa's barbecues, and it seemed like that was the plan for today. "Cute kids, right?" Cal asked, nodding toward the twins who were now exploring with the other children. "Oh, they're adorable," I replied with excitement. "Where are their parents? I haven't met them yet. I come here often enough. I should have seen them by now." "Well, their mom is divorced," Cal explained gently, clearly concerned about bringing it up. "She's very busy," he added. I thought for a moment. "Do you think she'd mind if I got the girls a little something for their birthday next month?" I asked. "I wouldn't want to intrude, but I'd love to do something nice for them." Cal looked at me with a hint of surprise. "Well, maybe you can ask her yourself sometime," he suggested. Just then, Melissa surprised Cal by playfully pinching his arm. "Hey!" he said in surprise. "What if I had been flipping something on the grill?" Melissa laughed. "I checked first," she said confidently. "Now you stop bothering my big brother, okay?" Cal just mumbled something and returned to the grill. "Don't worry about him," Melissa said, leaning against me. "I'll talk to their mom and make sure it's okay for you to give the girls something, all right?" I nodded in agreement. I glanced down the side of the house when I heard a car drive by, and Melissa noticed. "Oh, I meant to tell you," she said. "Sherry called. She has a bad headache and didn't want to come over today. She said she'd be home if you wanted to call her." I felt a little let down. I had hoped Sherry would come to the barbecue since she was friends with Melissa. "I might call her later," I replied. I started to notice a pattern in Sherry's actions. It seemed like she wanted to let me know she'd be home and suggested I check on her. I didn't understand why she felt the need to show that. It wasn't like I had the right to question her whereabouts. Still, it made me feel a bit more at ease. I wished she hadn't felt unwell. Melissa's diary. "I'm really happy for Ron and Sherry. They've been seeing each other for a bit over a month and a half, and from what I've heard, they're both having a great time. They don't openly call it dating, and my husband agrees with them, but that is exactly what it is. I get to hear from both of them, and I know they want to move on from their past. The problem is, neither knows if the other feels the same way. I'm bursting with information about how they feel, but Cal would get upset if I tried to interfere. I spoke with Connie recently, and she mentioned she and Tom were surprised that Ron and Sherry appear to be getting closer. I'm not surprised. These two have so much history together. Sherry was my roommate, and I know she was already imagining her name as Mrs. Sherry Masters just a week after meeting him. She couldn't eat or sleep until he called to ask her out on that first date, just 2 days after he saw her at a cafe. I can't see this situation lasting much longer. There seems to be something special drawing them together, and I believe they will realize their feelings soon. Sherry will have to think about her roommates, though. Things will definitely change when Ron finds out. I'm worried about that, ouch. Cal just poked me and told me not to interfere. Anyway, he wants to go upstairs now that the kids are over at the neighbor's place. Talk later. A couple of weeks later, I returned early from a quick trip to Denver. I met with the leader of the returning team from Afghanistan and got an update on our project. I also attended a conference with company executives. This was the last task I had as Deputy Assistant Director of Western Operations, and I felt relieved. It was tiring to keep track of 2 sets of problems. We finished the project a week ahead of schedule. The Army Corps of Engineers inspected the road and approved it. We learned a lot during the construction process, and next time we work with Halliburton, we'll be better prepared. We plan to create new guidelines for security and supply organization, just in case we are involved in something similar in the future. When we wrapped up late Friday afternoon, the CEO suggested I take one of the corporate jets to fly home comfortably instead of waiting until the next day. He told me to take the weekend off, and I was thrilled. I smiled, shook his hand, and happily accepted his offer. I ended up getting back to town about 18 hours sooner than I thought I would. It was dark, but still early in the evening. I checked how tired I was and realized that flying in a private jet was much better than dealing with commercial flights. I felt fresh and relaxed instead of stressed and worn out. I tried calling Melissa and Cal to let them know I was home, but the babysitter answered and wouldn't share their cell phone numbers since she didn't know me. I made a note to ask for both numbers when I saw them, so I decided to head to Fisher's, where I knew Melissa and Cal were planning to go. I wouldn't make it in time for dinner, but I could join them for the evening and watch everyone dance. I missed Fisher's, as many good memories were tied to that place, including time spent with Sherry before our divorce. I also had some nice moments there with Karen, too. I changed into a fresh shirt and tie and then decided to switch my suit as well. It only took a few minutes. I called Sherry to see if she wanted to come with me, but she wasn't home, which disappointed me a lot. When I arrived, the place was packed. The parking lot was full, and there were many people inside. I made my way inside, paid the cover charge, and walked into the crowd. I wasn't sure where Cal and Melissa were sitting, and with so many people, finding them might take a while. I squeezed into a small space near one of the bars and got a tall Coke with a splash of something just in case I got thirsty while searching. A few minutes later, I spotted them at a table near the dance floor. Melissa loved to dance and likely pulled Cal from dinner to be close to the music. I paused by a potted palm near the wall, using it for cover while I watched. That's when I saw Sherry leave the dance floor with an older gentleman. She returned to sit by Melissa, while the man walked off to join who I assumed was his wife at a booth nearby. Sherry wore a black cocktail dress that stopped a few inches above her knees. It looked layered, with a light chiffon over a smooth satin underlayer. The dress seemed to float around her. She had straps leading up around her neck, creating a simple but elegant look. The bodice was high, so there was no hint of anything revealing. The top layer was almost see-through, and the wide straps revealed her smooth skin. Her black heels accentuated her legs, making them look as beautiful as ever. I watched my ex-wife for a while and felt a bit silly doing so. Still, I stayed there for about half an hour. Sherry was alone without a date, surrounded by a bunch of men who wanted to enjoy her company. She danced along to fast music with some of the guys who came over, but she wouldn't dance to slow songs with them. While some men seemed annoyed by her refusal, she stood firm in her choice. The only ones she danced slow songs with were a few older gentlemen she seemed to trust, and one was Cal. I noticed one of her slow dance partners was a retired doctor who had been a family friend for many years. Sherry held an empty wine glass, spinning it with her fingers, and she turned down a refill when the waitress came by. What I saw confirmed what Melissa had been hinting at for a long time. She had been sharing bits of info and offering her opinions, saying Sherry hadn't dated since we split up, that she didn't drink, and kept herself out of trouble. I realized Melissa was not just being nice, it was all true. I felt a warm feeling start to grow inside me. Suddenly, I saw a connection forming in my mind. I had let go of my bitterness and hurt over the years, but I hadn't realized I was starting to wonder if I could trust Sherry again. I didn't think I'd want to trust her. Yet, she seemed to live her life as if she hoped someone was watching her. She was trying to show me she could be trusted, or at least give me reasons to start feeling that way. In that moment, I realized I really wanted to trust her, and that I wanted her to know how I felt. I tried not to think too far ahead. I placed my empty glass on a tray with others, took a deep breath, and made my way around a potted plant toward Sherry. When I was close to her table, Melissa spotted me on the dance floor. She had been dancing with Cal, but suddenly stopped, almost getting knocked over by a large couple rushing past. Melissa covered her mouth with both hands, watching me intently. Cal turned to see what was going on, and I saw a smile spread across his face. I could tell Melissa was getting emotional, and Cal was quickly pulling out a large handkerchief to give to her. As I walked towards the dance floor past Sherry's table, the angle made Sherry think Melissa was looking at her. I noticed her head tilt as she tried to understand why Melissa was staring. I stopped right by Sherry. She didn't know I was there yet. I was wondering if you might like to dance, I said, just loud enough for her to hear over the crowd. She started to shake her head no, since it was a slow song. Then she turned her head and looked at me. Startled, her wine glass slipped from her fingers and spun away. I caught it before it fell and set it safely on the table. She looked at me for a moment, surprised that I was there and had asked her to dance. After a while, her eyes lit up, and she nodded yes. I took her hand as she stood, then led her to the dance floor. In no time, she was in my arms. It felt wonderful. Sherry was a lovely woman. Without makeup, she looked nice, and with a little, she was truly beautiful. Her brown hair fell softly to her shoulders, moving gently with us as we danced. Her dark eyes stayed on mine as we moved slowly. Without thinking too much, I leaned down and kissed her softly. It was the first time I'd held her since our divorce, and the first kiss, too. But it felt so natural. I had sensed we were headed toward this moment for a while. I've never met anyone who takes my breath away the way you do, I told her softly. She smiled at me, tears forming in her eyes. Don't cry, I said. There's no reason to. Just then, we bumped into Cal and Melissa. Sherry let go of me and rushed to hug Melissa, both of them starting to cry. We need to go to the restroom, Melissa said with a sniffle. The two women hurried off, leaving Cal and me looking at each other. We both shrugged. Well, I'm not dancing with you, he said. Let's head back to the table before someone takes it, and maybe we can find something to drink. I agreed, and followed him to grab something for our dry throats. I drove Sherry back to Cal and Melissa's house after the party. She had come with them, and her car was parked there. It was too late for her to be driving around since most others out would be celebrating too much or up to no good. We sat in my SUV for a bit before she went inside. We chatted, but it was light and fun. We held hands like kids on their first date, a comparison I didn't mind one bit. After a while, we stopped talking and kissed again and again, as if to make up for lost time. When Cal and Melissa returned, having stopped for milk, I walked Sherry to the door and kissed her goodnight. I didn't want to stop, but I felt Sherry needed a moment to think about what had happened between us that night. I guess I did too. When I really thought about it, I realized I didn't have much to ponder. Instead, I welcomed the closeness we shared again, and it seemed she felt the same way. In the following weeks, I took Sherry out to dinner or a movie a few times. I would have done it more often, but we both had busy jobs and needed to rest. That meant we could only go out a few times during the week. Still, we made time to go out together a couple of times. On our second Wednesday out, I told Sherry for the first time in over 4.5 years that I loved her. That was 4 years and 8 months, to be exact. She softly said she loved me too, without even pausing. We spent the next half hour sharing gentle kisses and holding each other. If life had allowed us more time, we would have enjoyed each other more. But we had to think about the next day's work. As days passed, we became more at ease with saying love to each other and started to use the little affectionate words and gestures we had shared before. I began to appreciate why Karen had ended our relationship. I hadn't realized it before, but she understood something I didn't. She knew I hadn't been able to let go of the feelings I had for Sherry that I kept hidden for so long. I thought I could hide those feelings forever. I knew that, and I believed Karen did too, but holding back affected my relationship with her, and I think she sensed it. I remembered that I had hesitated when trying to be open with her. She was smart enough to see it would always be that way. I admired her for not accepting it. I mentioned this to her during a phone call the next evening. She laughed and thanked me for my kind words, but she said it had mostly been a gut feeling. I thanked her again. She then asked how things were going with Sherry. I was ready for the question and told her how much I cared for Sherry. I told Karen that her instincts were spot on, and she laughed again. While I was careful talking about my feelings for Sherry, Karen shared that she had met someone new. I recognized the guy, a Swedish observer from the International Red Cross who had come to the hospital where I had been. He seemed interested in America and everything about it. It seemed that he and Karen had discussed my condition many times, and he had become interested in the sad-voiced woman on the phone. After a moment, Karen told me that while I was asleep during the surgery, I had called out for Sherry. The Red Cross observer heard me and thought Karen was Sherry for a long time. I hadn't known this. I stayed quiet for a while. I didn't know how to say I was sorry for that. and I told her so. She said there was no need for an apology. She had suspected how I felt about Sherry, and this just confirmed it. Anyway, she mentioned that when the Red Cross guy came to the U.S. on a trip, he contacted her after finding her number. They had gone out a few times, and she told me she really liked him. She hoped I would, too. I tried to feel a bit jealous, even though I knew it wouldn't make sense, but I couldn't. I told her I wished her every happiness and meant it. She thanked me and hoped I would feel the same. She then asked if we could stay friends. I simply replied, forever. We ended the call, both feeling much better. I picked Sherry up a few times for what we called official dates at her apartment, but I never got to see inside. She would say her roommates had made a mess or had other reasons. I mentioned wanting to meet her roommates, and she said I would soon. She seemed to be hiding something, but it didn't feel like it was meant to hurt me. I understood she just didn't want to deal with it right now. Besides, I thought if her roommates were men, she would be more nervous about it, but she wasn't. So they likely weren't a threat to me. Still, I wondered about it. On a Friday night, 3 weeks after our first dance since the divorce, I picked her up, and we went to a nice restaurant in town. It had a 19th century San Francisco saloon theme. They had a swing hanging from the ceiling, and now and then a woman dressed like an old-time saloon girl would climb a ladder and swing over the crowd. This meant she showed a lot of her legs, which was clearly part of the show. I couldn't help but look. I was only human. But I wisely told Sherry that her legs were much prettier. It was true. Sherry blushed and seemed to glow every time the performer swung after that, making her even more beautiful in my eyes. Afterward, we went to see a late movie, but I'm not sure either of us really paid attention to it. I held her hand the whole time, and her head rested on my shoulder. I gave her little kisses on the top of her head and on her lips whenever I could. When the show ended, and we stepped outside into the warm Texas night, I couldn't remember a single thing about it. We didn't have any other plans, and I felt a mix of hesitation and excitement. Part of me wasn't sure if I wanted our relationship to move forward, but another part was eager for that next step. She stopped and leaned against the door of my SUV, pulling me in for a long kiss. We stayed close, feeling each other's warmth. My hands touched her shoulders and back. I wanted to move further, but we were in public, and I wasn't confident about what she wanted. I could sense her feelings, but she seemed to be holding back. When we finally stopped kissing, we both breathed heavily for a moment. I opened her door and helped her inside. I started the engine and turned on the lights, but I didn't drive off right away. When I looked at Sherry, she smiled and leaned closer, kissing me deeply. There was no sign of hesitation now. "Where do we go from here?" I asked softly after we paused for a moment. She gave me a quick kiss before answering. "Ron," she whispered, "you're in charge. You take us where you want." I understood her message. "Are you sure?" I wanted to make sure. She kissed me again and gently patted my hand. "I'm sure," she confirmed. Her voice was gentle yet firm. I put the SUV in gear and joined the nighttime traffic, feeling confident about where I wanted to go. When we reached my house, we shared another long kiss inside the door, filled with a strong feeling between us. Sherry pulled back and asked for something to drink. I took her hand and led her to the kitchen, where I had wine coolers in the fridge that she liked. She smiled brightly as she took one and drank it eagerly. I showed her around my new house, pointing out all the features that had caught my eye. She admired the fireplace. "That's so beautiful," she said. "It's just like the one I've always wanted in a home." I looked at the rock-lined fireplace, the wooden mantel, and the wide hearth. It matched what she had described to me when we talked about homes in our second year of marriage. We hadn't been able to afford it back then, but now that I could, I chose a house that had the fireplace she dreamed of. I realized that Karen had truly been a wise person. I felt nervous about taking Sherry upstairs to my room, and I could see a little worry on her face, too. We both understood that what we were about to do would change things for us, and it felt a bit scary. However, she didn't resist as I led her up the wide staircase and into my room. She had said I was in charge, and she acted like it. When she saw the open door to the large bathroom, something we both liked about the house, she stepped inside and closed the door briefly with a soft excuse. I was surprised to hear the shower running a moment later. The door opened a little, and she invited me to come in with her. This caught me off guard. In our last year of marriage, Sherry had only wanted to shower with me a few times. I managed to hang my pants and jacket over a chair instead of leaving them on the floor, but I quickly entered the bathroom. Sherry had her back to me when I came in and pulled the curtain closed. She glanced over her shoulder with a playful smile and tilted her head back for a long kiss. "I have a surprise for you," she said, her eyes gleaming. "But first, I want you to help me get clean all over, okay?" That sounded good to me. I soaped my hands well and started on her shoulders, rubbing the lather around. "Please, I want you to wash me everywhere," Sherry said softly. She looked back, but I couldn't quite read her expression. She didn't turn around fully, which made it hard to see her face, but something felt off, something I wasn't understanding. Then she handed me the shampoo bottle behind her. "Please?" she asked. There was a longing tone in her voice, and I didn't know why. Still, if Sherry wanted me to wash her from head to toe, I didn't mind. It was a nice moment between us. "Okay, but is this shampoo all right?" I asked. "It's just a store brand." She nodded. "It's fine," she said softly. I gently nudged her forward to get her under the water until her hair was soaked. She looked back at me, her eyes tightly shut. I chuckled, remembering how I used to say she looked like a pixie with her wet hair. Without opening her eyes, she leaned back for another kiss. She was smiling. The kiss felt a bit awkward, but slow and tender. It seemed she remembered those moments too. I squeezed some shampoo into my hand, rubbed it into my palms, and began to work it into her thick hair. As I washed her hair, I wondered what this was all about. Both of us had arrived that evening refreshed, neither needing much of a cleanup. Still, the idea of a warm, soothing shower together felt comforting. "You used to ask me to join you in the shower more often back then," Sherry said quietly, her voice tinged with a bit of regret. "I wish I'd listened and hadn't brushed it off," she added softly. I gave her a reassuring smile. "We can always make up for lost time," I replied, gently rinsing her hair under the warm spray. It took a moment before she answered. "Okay," she said, her tone brightening. I worked some conditioner into her hair, giving her a light scalp massage, and she relaxed into my hands, letting me rinse it out. She moved back and forth as needed, leaning comfortably against me. With her hair done, I lathered up my hands and began washing her shoulders and neck, spreading the soapy water gently across her skin. She seemed to enjoy every moment, not resisting as I worked my way around her arms and down her back. There was a quiet comfort in the way she let me take care of her, as if she needed this shared time as much as I did. She moved gracefully under my touch, and I realized how much I'd missed this simple closeness. As I washed her back, I couldn't help but notice how time had softened her figure. She was slender, but still had the familiar curves I remembered, with a natural grace in her posture. I continued to wash her with care, taking in the peacefulness of the moment. At one point, as I knelt to wash her legs, I paused, surprised by a small detail. "Wow," I said softly, caught off guard. She turned her head, smiling with a hint of playfulness. "Hey, that's your surprise?" she teased. "But you're not done yet, so keep going." Amused, I nodded and continued as she directed, enjoying the shared warmth of the moment. The laughter, light touches, and trust between us made the shower feel like more than just a routine. It was a quiet rediscovery of comfort and connection, filling the room with a gentle, unspoken joy. Sherry and I had never discussed certain aspects of intimacy while we were married, and some topics simply stayed untouched. But now it seemed she was open to exploring these quiet moments with trust and comfort. Her openness surprised me, and I sensed she was at ease. I lathered up my hands with soap and began gently washing her shoulders, letting the warm water help wash away any tension. Sherry relaxed, leaning forward against the shower wall, allowing me to continue without hesitation. As I worked, I kept my touch light and soothing, moving carefully to keep her comfortable and at ease. As we continued, Sherry sighed softly, a hint of thoughtfulness in her voice. "You know," she began, almost as if thinking out loud, "there are things I wish we'd tried before. Maybe I was just too worried or too set in my ways back then." I paused, giving her a reassuring smile. "Well," I replied warmly, "we're here now, and there's plenty of time to make new memories if you're open to it." She looked at me, a renewed spark in her eyes, and nodded with a smile. "Absolutely," she said. "There's so much we can do differently, better." I rinsed my hands and picked up the soap again, turning my attention to her face, gently working the lather across her forehead and cheeks. Sherry closed her eyes and lifted her face toward me, relaxed and trusting. The warm water had already washed away most of her makeup, and as the soap cleansed the rest, I noticed the natural beauty in her features, her light freckles, long lashes, and softly rounded cheeks. As I rinsed her face, I let my fingers gently brush across her lips, savoring the quiet simplicity of the moment. There was no rush, only the comfort of shared trust and a peaceful stillness that felt refreshing. I thought about kissing her, but sensed that perhaps this moment was better left, as it was a quiet, genuine connection. We hadn't shared a kiss since I'd started washing her. I was surprised when Sherry looked at me with a soft openness, allowing me to continue. A question had lingered in my mind from the moment we stepped into the shower, a quiet curiosity about what was happening. I moved steadily, letting the warm water wash over her as I gently rinsed her face and mouth. I continued down her neck, over her shoulders, then along her arms and down her sides. As I washed, I kept wondering what she might be seeking in this quiet moment. Suddenly, a thought struck me. I'd once read or heard that cleansing rituals were common in many cultures, a way to refresh both body and spirit. Perhaps in her own way, Sherry wanted a fresh start, a way to feel renewed. Whatever her reason, I respected her choice and focused on each simple, careful touch, ensuring she felt cared for. I moved to her chest, my hands gentle as I washed her, keeping her comfortable and focused on the ritual of the moment. Her expression told me she was calm, yet moved, her breathing soft, her eyes following my hands as I continued. As I worked down to her abdomen, I noticed she looked particularly at ease, almost peaceful. She watched me, and a light blush appeared on her cheeks. Her slight smile and bright eyes reflected her calmness and trust. When I moved lower, I saw that she had made a change. Her skin was entirely smooth. She looked at me, a bit of anticipation in her eyes. "Do you like it?" she asked, her voice quiet yet hopeful. "Oh, yes," I replied sincerely, noticing her effort to present herself differently. "How did you manage it?" "Electrolysis," she said simply, smiling softly. "Wow, that must have taken time. Did it hurt?" I asked, feeling surprised by the effort she'd made. She nodded, her tone warm. "It took nearly 6 months, a bit at a time. And yes, it hurt sometimes," she replied, still smiling, her voice steady and full of affection. I realized how much this simple act had meant to her, and I appreciated the thought and care she'd put into it. We stood together in the soft glow of the moment, knowing that these small gestures held meaning for both of us. Kneeling there with water streaming down, I looked up at her, genuinely surprised. I hadn't expected such a thoughtful gesture. "How did you know?" I asked, confused but touched. "I only decided to come back a few months ago, and neither of us could have known we'd be here like this. I actually did this last year," she said softly. "I had a feeling that someday we'd have this moment again." She looked away for a second, a few tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm glad," I replied, meaning every word. There wasn't much more to say, and it felt like enough. I continued washing her legs, making sure to rinse her thighs, calves, and feet thoroughly. As I finished, I could tell from the soft expression on her face that this quiet ritual held meaning for her. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she simply leaned closer, ready to embrace me. Gently, I placed a hand on her chest, stopping her for a moment with a warm smile. "Now it's your turn," I said softly. Her eyes lit up, and I could see the joy and understanding in them. She smiled back, nodding, and began to wash me with the same gentle care I'd shown her. She moved with patience, her touch calm and careful as she worked her way from my shoulders down. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing myself to relax and enjoy the simple care she was offering. She moved with the same quiet attentiveness, washing my hands and arms, then my back. It was a comforting, unspoken bond, both of us enjoying the closeness that hadn't needed words to be understood. "Is this okay?" she asked, a touch of hesitation in her voice, watching my face to make sure everything was all right. "Yes," I replied softly, grateful for her kindness and thoughtfulness. We stood there for a long while, letting the warm water wash away everything that didn't matter, as we shared a moment of pure understanding. Sherry looked up at me with a cheerful grin, catching her breath as we both shared a laugh. "Another thing I wish we'd done," she started, but I held up my hand gently, cutting her off. "Darling," I said, smiling warmly, "we're going to have plenty of time, no regrets or should-haves. Okay?" She nodded with a soft smile, and I added playfully, "Besides, I might have lost count tonight, but I'm sure I'll remember it all later." Her laugh was bright as she finished drying me off with playful care. When we were finally out of the shower, we wrapped ourselves in large, warm towels, sharing quick kisses and hugs as we dried each other's hair and enjoyed each other's company. I pulled her close for a long embrace, feeling a quiet joy between us as we wandered back to the bedroom. On the way, I dimmed the lights to create a soft, peaceful glow. In the bedroom, I guided Sherry gently to lie back on the bed, and I knelt beside her, enjoying the quiet comfort of the moment as we held hands and shared a few quiet words. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with a deep trust, and I knew this time was about reconnecting. I leaned down, brushing my hand over her hair, both of us lost in a shared sense of closeness. Sherry wrapped her arms around me, pulling me in for a deep, steady kiss, her expression showing just how much this moment meant to her. I took my time, cherishing the simplicity of holding her, and in that instant everything else faded away. After a while, we lay back together, our hands still intertwined, resting peacefully side by side. The soft lighting cast a gentle glow, and we both felt a sense of contentment, knowing we were sharing something special and timeless, just being there for each other, enjoying the comfort and warmth of a new beginning. In my mind, I replayed what she had said. Sherry wanted me to connect with her in a way that was different from how I usually expressed my love. I realized that this was as important to her as the special shower we had just shared. Hey everyone! Thanks for watching! Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.